By dawn, the temperature will drop to -30, and this shack, with cracks wide enough to fit a finger, won't hold the heat. Aiden Cross realizes this within the first few seconds as the wind pierces right through the thin planks and snow settles on the floor right at his feet. If he doesn't patch up the walls before dark, by morning they'll find him frozen to death right here on this floor. He sits down and rubs his face with his palms. Just an hour ago, he was sitting in his office on the 12th floor, finalizing the quarterly report. Now he's surrounded by 4 wooden walls, a low ceiling, and a door that rattles in the wind. A translucent panel hangs before his eyes. It announces that the world has entered the era of the Great Ice Age. Every midnight, the temperature will drop another 10 degrees. Every survivor has been issued a shelter. Further survival depends solely on the shelter's owner. Aiden rereads the lines 3 times. Then he pushes open the door and steps outside. Before him lies a white plain stretching all the way to the horizon. Scattered across the plain are hundreds of similar huts, maybe thousands. People are already coming out of some of them. They're shouting and looking around, then falling to their knees in the snow. Someone is running from hut to hut, calling his wife by name. Someone else stands motionless, staring at the gray sky. Aiden surveys his shelter from the outside and clenches his teeth. His hut is the most dilapidated of all those he can see. The planks are cracked and warped. The roof is sagged. One corner of the foundation has sunk into the ground. His neighbor's walls are smooth and solid. The nearest hut on the right looks almost like a summer cottage. A large man in a sports jacket steps out of it. He stretches, surveys his property, and slaps the wall with a satisfied thud. Then he notices Aiden and his crooked, ramshackle shack. The man smirks and says that someone's really out of luck today. He introduces himself as Darren and explains that he used to be a CrossFit coach and that in this new world, only the strong will survive. He glances at Aiden's narrow shoulders and his office pants and shakes his head. He says that office drones will be the first to freeze to death and that it'll be only fair. Aiden doesn't reply. He stares at the sun. The sun hangs low, shining dimly, and offering no warmth at all. It feels like it's about -10 right now. The display promises that by midnight it will be -20. Arguing with Darren means wasting time he doesn't have. Aiden returns to the hut and takes stock. Inside, there's a wooden cot, an old crate, and 3 planks against the wall. That's it. No stove, no food, no tools. He goes outside and walks across the plain. He's looking for anything that might seal the cracks. Between the huts lie items thrown out of other people's shelters, torn tarps, pieces of cardboard, and broken down boxes. People grab food and blankets first. No one pays any attention to the trash. Aiden, however, looks specifically at the trash. He remembers how, as a child, he caulked the bathhouse with his grandfather, and how his grandfather used to say that heat escapes not through the wall, but through the cracks. He gathers tarps and cardboard and bundles of stiff, dry grass sticking out from under the snow on a small hill. He makes one trip after another. His palms turn red, then white. He rubs them together and keeps going. A woman walks by with a medical bag slung over her shoulder. She glances briefly at his armful of junk and his ramshackle hut and walks on. By noon, a pile of materials lies by the hut. Aiden soaks the snow in a box until it's mushy, mixes it with the grass, and packs the mixture into the cracks between the boards. The mixture sets almost instantly in the cold. He works from the bottom up. He covers the north wall with tarpaulin and secures it with boards. From the inside, he lines the walls with 3 layers of cardboard. He hangs the door opening with scraps of tarpaulin. Darren comes over to look and bursts out laughing. He says that Aiden is building a birdhouse out of trash. He says he found a supply of firewood in his own hut, and that tonight he'll keep a fire burning all night long, just like a white man. Aiden silently packs the mixture into the last crack. He says only that firewood has a tendency to run out. Darren waves him off and walks away. By dusk, the sky is darkened to the color of lead. The temperature is creeping downward. Aiden can feel it in the way his breath turns into thick steam and in the way the snow stops sticking and starts crunching under his feet like styrofoam. Bonfires are flaring up across the plain. People are burning their own lounge chairs, crates, and even planks from the walls. Aiden watches this and shakes his head. They're burning their homes just to stay warm for one night. He goes inside and seals the entrance. He wraps himself in his jacket, sits down on a cot, and pulls his knees up to his chest. The cold seeps in anyway. His toes go numb. He stands up, squats down, waves his arms, and sits back down. Hour after hour passes like this. He keeps track of the time on the control panel. With 1 minute to go before midnight, he can barely feel his feet anymore. Then midnight strikes. A soft wave of light washes over the cabin. The wood around him creaks and shifts as if it were alive. The planks thicken before his eyes. The cracks close on their own. The walls become overgrown from the inside with a thick layer of light-colored wood. A new panel unfolds before his eyes. It informs him that the shelter possesses the hidden ability Midnight Evolution. If the shelter survives a full day, one of its properties automatically increases. The thermal insulation property has been raised to level 1. Aiden sits motionless, staring at the walls. Then he slowly places his palm against the planks. The boards are warm, not hot, but warm, like the side of a stove by morning. Within a few minutes, the air in the hut stops burning his lungs. His toes begin to tingle and come back to life. Aiden lies down on the cot, stares at the ceiling, and laughs silently. He'd ended up with the most dilapidated hut on the entire plain, and it seems to be the only one that grows on its own. He falls asleep for the first time in this endless day. In the morning, a scream wakes him. He pulls back the tarp and squints against the white light. The temperature outside is -20, and the air cuts into his throat. The scream comes from the hut 2 over from his. There, on the threshold, sits a gray-haired man holding a motionless woman in his arms and rocking back and forth. Along the row of huts, people with ashen faces are walking. The night has taken the first ones, those who slept in shelters full of holes, those who didn't seal the cracks. Aiden stands in the doorway of his hut, and warmth radiates from his door, a warmth visible in the shivering air. Darren emerges from his hut, angry and hunched over. Half his supply of firewood has burned away overnight. He's about to shout something mocking, but stops short. He looks at Aiden's cabin. Yesterday, it was a ramshackle shack with a sagging roof. Today, the walls stand straight. The planks look twice as thick, and steam rises from the doorway. Darren slowly shifts his gaze from the cabin to Aiden and back. His jaw moves with difficulty. He asks what's going on. Aiden shrugs and replies that he just caulked the cracks well. He tugs the tarp tight and goes inside. Darren remains standing in the cold, watching the wisp of warm steam rising above the stranger's door. And for the first time, there's no mockery in his eyes. There's something worse there. Envy appears in them. Aiden sits inside and listens to the snow crunching under Darren's footsteps outside. The footsteps circle around the cabin. Then they stop at the door. Darren calls him outside, and his voice is different now. Yesterday, that voice held contempt. Today, it holds a business-like gentleness. Aiden pulls back the tarp but doesn't step outside. Darren smiles and suggests they join forces. He says he has strength and firewood, while Aiden apparently has a talent for insulation. He offers for Aiden to move in with him and insulate his cabin the same way. Aiden replies that everyone survives in their own shelter, and that's what the rules on the bulletin board say. Darren's smile lingers for another second before fading. He says he'll remember that answer. He turns and walks away, the snow crunching menacingly and quickly beneath his feet. Aiden tugs the tarp tight and exhales. He realizes one simple thing. A warm hut in the middle of a freezing plain isn't just a refuge. It's a target. He needs to hold out until midnight and get the next upgrade. And to do that, he has to survive the day among people who are beginning to realize that their shelters won't save them. He eats half a chocolate bar for breakfast, one that had been sitting in his jacket pocket since his office days. He has no other food, and that's his second problem after the people. He steps outside with a box tucked under his arm. His plan for the day is simple: food, fuel for the road, and tools. He heads to the far edge of the plain where the night has struck hardest. There stand huts from which no one will ever emerge again. Near one of them, 2 men are already bustling about, hauling blankets outside. The looting has begun of its own accord, without any announcements. Aiden chooses a hut off to the side. Inside, on a cot, lies a frozen man in a suit very similar to his own. Aiden stands over him for a few seconds, gripping the edge of the box until his fingers ache. Then he takes off his jacket and covers the dead man's face with it. He takes a can of crackers, a lighter, a folding knife, and a warm jacket hanging on a hook from the hut. He puts the jacket on and says thank you to the dead man. In 3 trips, he gathers a small supply, 6 cans of food, a coil of rope, a hatchet with a cracked handle, and half a bag of crackers. He sees other scavengers roaming the plain, and 2 of them already fighting over a sleeping bag. People are changing right before his eyes. By noon, he spots that same woman with the medical bag, and she's going from hut to hut examining people with frostbite. People slip hardtack into her pockets as a token of gratitude. She works silently and quickly. Near one hut, she straightens up and rubs her blue-tinged fingers. And Aiden sees that her own jacket is as thin as an autumn one. He walks up to her, places a can of food in front of her, and says, "It's payment in advance." He says he lives in the cabin with the sagging roof on the eastern edge, and that if she freezes to death, there'll be no one left to treat everyone. The woman looks at him with dry skepticism. She says her name is Naomi, and that she saw him yesterday carrying an armful of junk. She says the junk won't save him, and that in 3 nights all those planks will become coffins at -40. She takes the can and walks off to the next person suffering from frostbite. Aiden doesn't argue. Skeptics aren't convinced by words. By evening, he hauls his haul inside and takes stock. Enough food to last a week if he's very frugal. He eats crackers and listens as the plane prepares for nightfall once more. There are fewer campfires tonight. Almost no one has any firewood left. Instead, the sound of axes can be heard coming from several huts. People are dismantling the homes of the dead and hauling the planks away for themselves. At dusk, footsteps approach his door once more. They're heavy, and there's more than one pair. Darren brings 2 men with him, their faces red from the cold. He says through the tarp that they've discussed everything and decided that such a warm shelter cannot belong to just one person. He says it will be a communal house. Aiden stands inside with a small hatchet in his hand, saying nothing. His heart is pounding in his throat. There are 3 of them, and every one of them is bigger than he is. Then he hears Naomi's voice. She tells the men that it will be -30 tonight, and that anyone who gets injured now won't make it until morning because the blood won't stop flowing in such freezing cold. She says this in a matter-of-fact, clinical tone, as if stating a diagnosis. The men shift from foot to foot. Darren mutters that they'll be back and that tomorrow's conversation will be different. Footsteps fade away. Aiden pulls back the tarp. Naomi is standing at his door with her bag, looking at him with the same dry skepticism. She says she didn't save him. She just prevented a foolish mistake. Then her gaze drifts over his shoulder and into the cabin. A steady stream of warm air wafts out from inside. Her pupils dilate. She asks slowly why it's warmer inside than it was in her apartment in the winter. Aiden replies that he's insulated it well and offers to let her wait out the night inside, right by his doorway. He says that a medic needs to survive until morning and that this isn't charity, but a calculated move. Naomi hesitates, glances at her thin jacket, and steps inside. Inside, she pulls off her gloves and presses her palms against the warm wall, and for the first time, the sternness fades from her face. She touches the wooden planks, frowns, and says that wood can't generate heat on its own. Aiden says nothing and shares some crackers with her. At midnight, a soft wave of light floods the cabin once more. Naomi jumps up and presses her back against the wall. In the middle of the cabin, a structure made of dark stone rises from the floor. It assembles itself as if being shaped by invisible hands. A minute later, a squat stove with a cast iron door and a chimney extending through the roof stands against the far wall. Behind the door, a steady crimson glow is already smoldering. The panel indicates that the shelter has survived its second day. The unquenchable hearth property has been added. The stove requires no fuel and burns eternally. Naomi looks at the stove, then at Aiden, then back at the stove. She tries to sit on the cot, but ends up on the floor without even noticing. She says she's either gone crazy, or this shed has just grown a stove of its own. Aiden opens the door and the heat washes over them both. He says his house grows every midnight and that now she knows his biggest secret. He says it's up to her to decide what to do with this knowledge. Naomi stares into the fire for a long time. Then she says that in the morning, people will see smoke coming from his chimney. She says that 3 people came to see him yesterday, and tomorrow 30 will come. Aiden looks at the chimney and realizes she's right. The stove has just saved him from the cold, and yet it has also given him away to the entire plain. Far away on the northern edge of the plain, at this very moment, a man with a scar on his chin lowers his binoculars and tells his men that smoke has appeared in the east. He says that smoke means heat, and heat means power, and he orders them to find out who is so wealthy over there. The man with the scar doesn't keep them waiting. His men arrive at dawn, just as Aiden is shoveling a mound of snow from under the door, and Naomi is checking the frostbitten fingers of the 5-person line at his threshold. The line formed on its own. Word of a warm hut with smoke had spread across the eastern edge even before sunrise. People stand there, holding their hands out toward the stream of warm air coming from the crack in the door and gazing at the chimney as if it were a miracle. 2 men who've come from the north push their way through the line. Both are wearing sturdy jackets that are clearly not their own. The older one declares that the plain is now under the protection of Commandant Colton Vale. He says that the Commandant has restored order in the north and that order comes at a price. Every shelter owner pays a weekly fee in food or goods. Owners of special shelters pay a special fee. He looks at the pipe, smirks, and says that for a pipe like that, the Commandant has set the fee at 4 cans of food per week, or the Commandant will come and inspect the chimney himself. Aiden asks what will happen to those who don't pay. The elder shrugs and replies that fires happen to those who don't pay. It's funny to say, fires in the middle of an icy desert. They walk away and the line falls silent. Naomi looks at Aiden and her gaze says she warned him. Aiden hands them 4 cans out of his 6 as they leave. Not because he's afraid, because he needs time until midnight. Every midnight makes him stronger, and it's foolish to get into a fight a day before the next gift. During the day, he works to strengthen their position in another way. He lets the elderly and children warm up in groups of 10 for 1 hour at a time. Naomi organizes the line and keeps track of everyone. The fee is nominal. Whoever can brings a plank or a handful of crackers or simply fixes something around the hut. Those who can't contribute warm up for free. Darren watches this from the doorway of his cooling cabin and plays with his marbles. He ran out of firewood last night. In the evening, he joins the general line with everyone else and avoids Aiden's gaze. Aiden lets him in without saying a word. Darren warms his hands by the stove and remains silent throughout his shift, leaving just as quietly. But as he's leaving, he pauses in the doorway and says quietly that he was wrong about the office plankton. At midnight, light floods the cabin for the 3rd time. The eastern wall shudders and expands outward. An extension bulges out from it and grows, its walls made of thick, cloudy glass. Inside the extension, raised beds of black, steaming soil rise up. Green sprouts emerge from the soil right before our eyes. A notification panel states that the round-the-clock greenhouse feature has been added. Plants in the greenhouse complete a full growth cycle in a single day. Aiden stands among the garden beds and watches as lettuce leaves unfurl, bean pods swell, and potato tops stretch upward. The warm, humid air smells of earth and summer. He drops to his knees, touches the soil with his hands, and stays there for a long time. In a world where food has become more precious than gold, his home has just begun producing food faster than it can be eaten. In the morning, he harvests the first crop, 12 heads of lettuce, a bucket of beans, new potatoes. At the sight of the greenery, Naomi freezes and says that in a month, half the plain will start suffering from scurvy, and that these leaves will soon be more valuable than bullets. Aiden nods and asks her to find him a merchant, not a bandit from the north, but a real merchant, By noon, Naomi brings in a gaunt, wiry old man with a sled. The old man introduces himself as Holt and says he ran a shop for 40 years and that barter is the only law that will survive any apocalypse. He looks at Aiden with an indulgent squint and asks what the guy in office pants has to offer. You can tell by the look on his face that he's only here out of respect for Naomi and that he expects to see a couple of hardtack. Aiden silently leads him into the greenhouse. Holt takes 2 steps between the garden beds and stops. His condescending squint widens into 2 round eyes. He takes off his hat. He touches a lettuce leaf as one might touch a museum exhibit, brings his fingers to his nose, and sniffs. Then he turns to Aiden and says in a completely different voice that he's ready to take all the greens Aiden can supply. He says that out on the plains, people are already trading gold rings for a can of stewed meat, and that for fresh food, people will give up anything. By evening, they've sealed the deal. Holt takes the first shipment and leaves behind an axe, some nails, 2 sleeping bags, a sack of flour, and, most importantly, information. Here's the information. Commandant Vale holds the northern edge with a force of 80 men, 20 of whom are armed. The contributions are just the beginning. Vale is looking for special shelters. There are several of them across the plains. One man's hut filters water, another's repairs itself. Vale selects these shelters and settles his people there while driving the owners out into the cold. Holt looks at the stove and the greenhouse and says that Vale won't impose a tribute on a hut like this. Vale will take a hut like that for himself entirely. Aiden sees the old man off, stands in the doorway, and looks north. He's gotten a stove, a greenhouse, a merchant, and a line of grateful people, and each of his successes acts as a beacon. Yesterday, he was a strange neighbor with a warm, ramshackle hut. Today, he's the richest man in the eastern region. Naomi wakes him up in the middle of the night. She was keeping watch by the door and noticed movement. Aiden presses his face against the crack in the wall. 100 paces from the cabin, against the backdrop of the blue night snow, stand 4 figures. They neither approach nor leave. They simply stand there, looking at the cabin and counting. Windows, outbuildings, people at the threshold. Then they turn and head north. Aiden steps away from the crack and sits down by the stove. Naomi asks how much time they have. Aiden stares into the fire and replies that they have exactly as many midnights as it will take for Vale to arrive, and that from now on, every midnight is a race. Aiden doesn't go to bed until morning. He sits by the stove and counts the odds on his fingers. Vale has 80 men and 20 guns. He himself has an axe, a folding knife, a medic, and a disgraced crossfitter. They can't hold him off by force. He lays out everything he got from Holt on the floor and thinks. Then he wakes up Naomi and Darren, whom he'd let spend the night on the doorstep yesterday for helping with the line. He tells them that Vale will arrive in the coming days and that they can't defend the cabin on their own. He says that warmth and food are the only weapons they have, and that they need to arm the entire eastern border. The plan is simple. Everyone who gets an hour by the stove and a bunch of greens must owe the eastern edge 1 shift or 1 task. Darren, along with his acquaintances, gathers the strongest men for guard duty. Naomi keeps track of everyone and tends to the sick. Holt trades surplus crops for any tools and weapons he can find. Darren listens, and the disbelief struggles with something new. He says that people won't fight for someone else's hut. Aiden replies that people will fight for their own source of heat and food, and that the goal is to make the hut exactly that, a home for everyone. The day turns into a construction site. Here's how it goes. In the morning, 20 people dig a trench in the frozen ground in an arc from the north and drive sharpened planks from the ruined huts into the embankment. In the afternoon, Holt brings 3 hunting rifles, 24 rounds of ammunition, and a coil of barbed wire from some warehouse, and Darren stations his men on the first shift on the hillock. In the evening, the women, led by Naomi, haul snow to the hut, pour water on it, and build a man-high wall of ice around the fence. By nightfall, the eastern edge looks for the first time not like a scattering of huts, but like a camp with a center. And the center of this camp is filled with smoke and glows, with the warm light of the greenhouse. At midnight, the light of the midnight evolution is already visible to dozens of people. They stand behind the ice wall and watch as a square tower rises above the hut. It rises 3 human heights above the roof. Narrow loopholes are cut into its walls. Beneath the turret's roof, a weapon resembling a barrel made of dark ice slowly rotates. A notification panel indicates that the gun tower ability has been added. The tower automatically detects threats to its owner and the shelter and strikes them with charges of freezing energy. The people behind the wall are silent. Then someone starts laughing with relief, and the laughter spreads through the crowd. Darren stands with his head tilted back and says that the treadmill in his gym was more high-tech than anything he'd seen in his entire life. But he's never seen anything like this. Vale arrives the next day in the afternoon. He brings 30 men, and they line up in a loose chain 100 paces from the moat. Vale himself steps forward in a white army coat. The scar on his chin is visible, even from a distance. Walking beside him is a burly man with an assault rifle slung across his chest. Holt, standing behind the rampart, whispers that this is Rourke, Vale's head of security and a former escort, and that it was Rourke who had burned down the huts of those who failed to pay. Vale speaks loudly and calmly. He says he has come not to fight, but to restore order. He says that the special shelter is a resource for the entire plane and that the strongest must manage that resource. He offers Aiden the honorary position of caretaker of his own hut, along with a ration. The crowd behind the rampart is silent, and Aiden can feel with his back how, in this silence, the scales are not tipping. He steps out onto the rampart. He says that the eastern frontier feeds and warms everyone who works, and that order already exists here. He says that Vale is welcome to come and warm himself in the communal line like anyone else, unarmed. The chain of northerners roars with laughter. Rourke lowers his assault rifle from his chest and says the negotiations are over. He takes a step forward and raises the barrel. Everything that follows happens in the blink of an eye. The tower above the hut swivels with a brief creak. A white flash shoots silently from the icy barrel. A cloud of frost envelops Rourke. When the cloud settles, Rourke stands frozen up to his chest in a crust of ice. The assault rifle in his hands has turned into a block of ice. He's alive and breathing, his eyes darting about, but his body can't move a single finger. The chain of northerners retreats. 2 of them raise their rifles, and the turret swivels again. 2 flashes are enough to encase the rifles along with the shooter's arms in ice up to the elbows. No one fires anymore. Vale stands motionless, staring at the tower and his frozen head of security. His face betrays no emotion, but his Adam's apple twitches. Aiden calls from the rampart that the ice will break in an hour and that Vale can take his men away. He says that the eastern frontier will no longer pay the tribute. The northerners leave, dragging the thawed-out Rourke by the arms, and just before they leave, Rourke turns around. This man burned houses along with their inhabitants and never flinched. Now he gazes at the tower with a lingering look, and for the first time there is neither malice nor contempt in that gaze. Only fear remains in it. That evening, the eastern frontier celebrates. Holt passes the flask around. Darren, the guest of honor, recounts the incident for the 4th time, and with each retelling, his demeanor grows colder. Only Naomi isn't celebrating. She sits down next to Aiden by the stove and says she saw Vale's face at the moment the shot was fired. She says that's not how the undefeated look. That's the look of people who've miscalculated the cost and gone to borrow money. She turns out to be right sooner than anyone would have liked. That night, Holt returns from a trip to the western edge to exchange greenbacks, and his face is gray, not from the cold. He says news is spreading across the plain. Vale has sent messengers over the pass to the convoy. Aiden asks what the convoy is. Holt warms his hands by the stove and doesn't answer right away. He says the convoy is 300 people in tracked vehicles who travel from valley to valley. They call themselves the Heritage Collectors. They take everything of value that the system has left behind, and they don't give people a second thought. He says that Vale has offered them the richest cabin this plane has ever seen, and that the convoy never turns down offers like that. Aiden listens to Holt, stares into the fire, and remains silent for so long that Darren can't take it anymore and asks how long it will take the convoy to reach them. Holt replies that the pass is a 4-day journey for tracked vehicles, weather permitting, and he immediately adds that the weather won't permit it. He nods toward the display that the entire plane saw that evening. The display announced the first global event. In 2 days, the white wave will arrive from the north, a front of extreme cold at -70 that will last a full day. The display advises survivors to seek top-tier shelter and wishes them luck with the same official politeness with which it once informed Aiden about the distribution of huts. Holt says that the white wave will hold the convoy up at the pass. Naomi says the white wave will wipe out the entire eastern frontier first. She lays out her calculations like a medical diagnosis. Even standing room only, Aiden's cabin will hold 40 people. Nearly 400 live beyond the rampart. No one has a stove anymore. At -70, an ordinary hut cools down to a deadly chill in 3 hours. The people by the stove fall silent, and in the stillness, you can hear the wind already testing the icy wall's strength. Aiden stands up. He says there are 2 midnights until the wave, and that his house will have time to grow twice more. He says he doesn't know what will grow tonight, but that we must prepare as if nothing will grow at all. The next day, the plane lives as a single organism, and this is again a montage of 4 shots. In the morning, everyone with an axe dismantles the distant, abandoned huts, hauls the planks to the center, and builds long, cramped barracks around Aiden's hut, pressing them tightly against its warm walls so the wood can absorb at least some of the heat. During the day, the women caulk the cracks in the barracks with that very same mixture of snow slush and grass that had saved Aiden on the first night, and he walks along the walls, showing them how to pack it in from the bottom up. In the evening, Holt distributes all the winter supplies he's bartered for over the week, according to Naomi's lists, and the people sew the blankets into communal cocoons, each large enough for 10 bodies. At night, Darren shuttles shifts back and forth from the hill to the warmth every 20 minutes because the frost has already crept down to -50 and the sentries can no longer feel their faces. At midnight, light floods the hut and all 400 people watch with bated breath. Thin pillars of dark stone shoot up from the foundation along the perimeter of the barracks. A shimmering veil of warm air stretches between the pillars. The panel reports that the thermal contour property has been added. The contour traps the heat from the hearth within the perimeter. Inside the contour, the temperature rises to a tolerable level. This is a lifesaver for the barracks, but Aiden reads the description twice and clenches his jaw. The contour retains heat. The contour won't stop -70. It's a barrier against drafts, not against the wave. Naomi looks at him and understands without words. She tells the others that everything is fine and that they need to keep preparing. The second day passes at the same pace, and by evening, the sky in the north changes. It doesn't darken. On the contrary, it fades to a deathly whiteness, and this whiteness slowly rises from the horizon, devouring the blue. The wind dies down completely. The plane lies in such silence that you can hear the ice crackling on the embankment. People crowd into the barracks and the hut, and Naomi assigns the elderly and children spots closer to the stove. An hour before midnight, something Aiden hadn't expected arrives. People are trudging across the plain from the northern edge. First a dozen, then 50, then more. Northerners. People from Vale and ordinary residents of his region, whom the commandant had kept in line all winter with levies. Their huts won't survive the storm, so they're heading toward the only smoke on the plain. And behind them all, separate from the crowd, walks a man in a white sheepskin coat. Vale approaches the rampart and stops in front of Aiden, remaining silent for a very long time. Then he says that his people will freeze to death tonight. He doesn't bargain or make threats. He simply stands there, the man who sold this hut to the convoy, and asks her for shelter. Darren, standing behind Aiden, says they can't let him in, not even to the moat. Aiden looks at the crowd behind Vale. There are women, old people, and children, all with equally gray faces. He says he'll let everyone in. He says the northerners will deposit their weapons in a pit by the moat, and that Vale will enter last and spend the whole night hauling snow for drinking, just like everyone else. Vale looks at him for a second, then silently pulls a knife from his belt and is the first to throw it into the pit. The Northerners are crammed into the barracks in the final minutes. It's so crowded, they can't even raise their arms. And then the wave comes. It comes without wind. Just a whiteness creeps down from the sky onto the plain, and the world outside the perimeter dies. The air behind the warm film turns murky like milk. Distant, empty huts burst one after another with a crackling sound like gunshots. The frost presses against the perimeter, and the film of warm air shivers and sags, and the temperature in the barracks creeps downward. It's -5, inside -10. The children are crying. Naomi goes from barrack to barrack, urging people to move around and rub each other down. Aiden stands by the stove, staring at the panel where the clock creeps along, and prays to all the gods of the new world for one thing, that midnight would come before the perimeter gives way. Midnight arrives. The light of the midnight evolution flares up brighter than it ever has before. From the top of the armory tower, a vertical pillar of golden radiance shoots up and unfolds over the camp like an umbrella. The radiance flows down an invisible sphere all the way to the ground and closes in behind the ice wall. The panel reports that the shelter has survived its 6th day under the conditions of the global event. A top-tier property has been added: the energy dome. The dome completely isolates the interior from the outside environment and absorbs damage of any kind. The white, sub-zero milk crashes against the golden sphere from the outside and cannot penetrate it. Inside the dome, however, the temperature rises to spring-like levels within a few minutes. People crawl out of the barracks, stand with their heads tilted back, and watch as a golden sky burns above them in the midst of a devastated world. Someone laughs, someone cries. Darren sits down right in the snow, which has already begun to thaw, and Vale stands in the middle of the enemy camp with a bucket of melted water in his hands, looking up at the dome from below. The man who called himself the strongest on the plain and enforced order with gun barrels. His lips move. Naomi stands nearby and hears the commander of the North quietly say to himself that he'd done everything wrong. For the duration of the White Wave, the camp lives under the golden sky as one family. And when the wave recedes and the dome dims its radiance to a faint glow, Aiden climbs the tower and looks north through Holt's binoculars. The plain after the wave lies dead and smooth. And across this dead expanse, dots are creeping from the pass. He counts them, loses count, and counts again. 12 tracked vehicles are moving in a column, and a flag made of striped canvas flies above the lead vehicle. The convoy survived the wave beyond the pass, and now it is heading to see the hut that survived it in the open field. The control panel announced the White Wave at -70, and the eastern flank built barracks around the hut in 2 days, while the 5th midnight provided a thermal contour, which was barely enough for survival. Before the wave, Aiden took in the unarmed Northerners and Vale himself on the condition of collective labor, and at the 6th midnight, the shelter received a top-class energy dome that saved all 400-plus people. After the wave receded from the pass, a convoy column of 12 tracked vehicles appeared, heading toward the hut. The 12 vehicles reached the eastern edge by noon and formed a semicircle 300 paces from the moat. Their engines remained running. A steady metallic hum hangs over the plain, and this hum weighs on the people more heavily than any scream. Aiden stands on the tower and observes the convoy through his binoculars. The vehicles are sheathed in sheets of iron and hung with canisters, and they have hooks and winches on their sides. This isn't an army, it's a mobile factory for dismantling other people's property. People in identical gray cloaks walk among the vehicles, and none of them look at the dome with surprise. They look the way movers look at a wardrobe they're about to carry out. 3 men break away from the lead vehicle and walk toward a pile marked by a white rag on a stick. Leading the way is a tall man with a weather-beaten face and gray stubble. Holt remarks from below that this is Magnus Farrow himself, the convoy commander, and that, according to rumors, he was an engineer at the northern mines even before the Ice Age. Beside Farrow scurries a skinny guy with a tin clipboard, jotting down notes the whole way, writing something down. Farrow stops at the moat and examines the rampart, the tower, and the edges of the dome with calm, professional interest. He speaks without a threat and without a greeting. He says that the convoy is gathering the system's heritage for the Great Refuge in the Southern Valley, where all of humanity's survivors will one day gather. He says that according to the convoy's code, a top-tier shelter is subject to seizure and transport. He says the residents will be given 24 hours to pack and will even be given fuel for their fires. Aiden asks from the rampart if they've already transported even a single living shelter. The skinny guy with the tablet looks up and makes eye contact for the first time. He says they've transported 6 and that he personally documented each one. Pharaoh gives the guy a brief look, and he falls silent. Aiden says this house isn't just an object. He says the house has become one with the land and the people, and that 400 people are alive only because of it. He offers the convoy a deal: food, warmth, and shelter under the dome in exchange for fuel and scrap metal. Pharaoh listens without interrupting and shakes his head. He replies that the code does not allow for trade with a confiscated object. He says this without malice, as if discussing the weather. Then he adds that a day has passed, turns around, and walks back to the vehicles. The skinny guy pauses for a second and looks at the stream of warm air rising above the dome and at the green patch of the greenhouse behind the glass. Something not covered by the code flashes in his eyes. Then he catches up with the commander. The camp gathers in the hut for a council. Darren suggests striking first while convoy hasn't turned around yet. Holt shakes his head and says that the convoy has harpoon cannons mounted on its sides for taking out cover, and that charging them with just 3 rifles is a surefire way to die. Vel remains silent throughout the meeting and speaks last. He says he knows how Pharaoh operates because he wanted to work that way himself. He says Pharaoh won't launch a head-on assault. First, he'll cut the camp off from everything else, from water, from raids, from trade. And then he'll offer food to those trying to leave and drive a wedge between the people from within. Aiden listens to his former enemy and realizes he's right. The dome's strength lies in the fact that it keeps everything out. The camp's weakness is that inside the dome, there's neither a well nor enough supplies to feed 400 mouths for more than a week. He looks at the panel, which shows 6 hours remaining until midnight, and tells everyone to prepare for a siege. They melt snow for water in 3 shifts. The greenhouse crop is harvested down to the last leaf, and Naomi introduces ration cards. Darren marks out the guard posts. Vale gets up on his own to haul snow, and the Northerners, watching him, follow suit. By evening, the convoy begins to move. The vehicles fan out and encircle the camp within firing range. Long poles are removed from the sides of the vehicles, driven into the frozen ground in a circle, and wires are strung between them. Holt watches this and doesn't understand. Vale understands. He says he saw something like this when the 3rd shelter was dismantled. The convoy is setting up discharge devices that draw energy from systems and legacies. They use them to jam the shelter's defenses before seizure. By nightfall, the ring of wires closes, and the dome begins to change. The golden glow at the edges fades and shifts toward gray. The membrane overhead ripples in slow waves like water in the wind. Inside, it grows visibly cooler. People emerge from the barracks, look up, and remain silent. Aiden stands beneath the fading sky of his home and feels his fingers go numb. Not from the cold, from rage. His home is being strangled by wires like a noose. Midnight comes quietly this time. The light of evolution breaks through the weakened dome, pale as if through dirty glass. A long extension made of dark wood and stone is attached to the western wall of the hut. Inside it, workbenches, a forge, vise, and tool racks materialize on their own. An even white flame burns above the forge without any firewood. A notification panel indicates that the natural workshop ability has been added. The workshop speeds up any work with wood, metal, and stone tenfold and automatically suggests blueprints to the owner based on the materials available to him. Aiden stands in the middle of the workshop and at first doesn't understand why he needs workbenches when the dome is being crushed outside. Then a scroll of blueprints unfolds before his eyes, and he sees one among them and freezes. The blueprint has a simple name: Contour Cutter, a device on skids that severs others' energy chains. Materials: iron, wire, and ice glass from the shaft. All of this is available at the camp. Aiden lifts his head and looks through the murky dome toward where the Pharaoh machines are humming. The convoy gave him 24 hours to get ready. The workshop promises that 24 hours is plenty of time. He steps out onto the threshold and summons everyone who has ever held a tool in their hands. And when, an hour later, metal screeches and sparks fly in the workshop, even Holt, who for 40 years had valued everything in the world through the eyes of a merchant, stands at the workbench, shakes his head, and says that for the first time in his life, he's seen a place where work moves faster than thought. A convoy under the command of engineer Magnus Pharaoh surrounded the camp and, in accordance with the code, demanded that the shelter be dismantled, granting 24 hours to pack up, but rejecting any trade. That night, the convoy closed a ring of discharge devices around the dome, which sucked away the protective energy, and the dome began to dim. At 7 o'clock midnight, the natural workshop appeared, which speeds up work tenfold and suggests blueprints, and Aiden found within it a blueprint for a contour cutter capable of severing the chain of discharge devices. Of note is the gaunt clerk Pharaoh with a tin tablet who took an interest in the camp. The workshop stays awake all night and all the next day. Work proceeds with assembly in 4 shifts. At dawn, Aiden and Holt dismantle everything unnecessary, from the door hinges of abandoned huts to the runners of old sleds for scrap metal, and the furnaces remelt it into ingots faster than they can be brought in. During the day, 10 pairs of hands assemble 3 stocky, sled-mounted machines according to the blueprints, each the size of a doghouse, with an ice glass claw at the front. In the evening, Darren selects 6 volunteers for a sortie and makes them run around the camp with loads on their backs until Naomi forbids him from pushing people to the point of vomiting. At night, Vale sketches the convoy's post layout in the snow, a layout he'd memorized from the former commandant's perspective, and points out 3 blind spots between the machines. The plan is simple and audacious. The dome is jammed by 12 dischargers connected in a single ring. That ring is a chain. The chain breaks at a single link. 3 cutters will break through the 3 blind spots and cut the wires in 3 places at once. Aiden leads the first group himself. Darren leads the second. To everyone's surprise, Vale asks to lead the third. Darren jumps to his feet and says that a traitor can't be allowed beyond the rampart with a machine in his hands. Vale replies calmly that if he wants to atone for his debt, it won't be with a bucket of melted snow. Aiden stares at the former commandant for a long second, hands him the group, and watches Darren's jaw clench. They set out an hour before midnight, just as the convoy's searchlights are blinded by the blizzard that has begun. Aiden crawls through the snow, pushing the cutter ahead of him, hearing nothing but his own heartbeat. The wires hum low and sickeningly in the cold. His squad reaches the line, and a claw of icy glass clamps down on the cable. The cutter begins to draw in someone else's current with a quiet crackle. To the left, in the darkness, a second one crackles. It's quiet on the right for a long time, and Aiden has time to imagine the worst for Vale. Then a third one crackles. The ring breaks in 3 places at once, and above the camp, the dome flares up with gold at full power so that the snow around it glows with reflected light, and in this light, the teams become clearly visible. Searchlights beam from the vehicles. The first shots ring out. Aiden runs toward the rampart and snow flies up in little fountains to the right and left. He sees Darren's group storming over the moat. He sees 2 members of Vale's group dragging a third, and that third man is Vale himself, with a dark trail stretching behind him across the snow. The gun turret finally reaches full dome power and swivels, and white flashes fan out in front of the convoy's vehicles, freezing an icy ridge across the plain. The firing subsides. The entire sortie returns behind the rampart. Vale is carried into the hut, and Naomi cuts open his sheepskin coat. The bullet went right through his side. Naomi works for an hour, then emerges with a pale face and says he'll survive if the infection doesn't set in. She adds quietly that in this world, without medicine, the infection almost always sets in. In the morning, the convoy changes tactics exactly as Vale had predicted. A single unarmed man walks from the vehicles toward the rampart, carrying a sack over his shoulder. He is a gaunt clerk with a tin clipboard. He stops by the moat and says his name is Cyrus, and that Commander Pharaoh is making a final offer to the camp. Anyone who comes out and leaves the shelter will receive a 2-week ration and a place by the convoy's campfires. He unties the sack and shows the cans and hardtack. He speaks loudly so that the entire rampart can hear. The shelter will be taken away anyway. The only question is how many people will survive until then, and it works. By evening, 36 people with bundles have gathered at the gate. Mostly newcomers from the northern border, but there are locals too. The old man who repaired Aiden's fence. The woman with 2 children whom Naomi treated for frostbite. People avoid looking Aiden in the eye and say that the children need food and that the dome won't last forever. Darren blocks the gate and shouts that cowards should be sent away without their belongings. Aiden pushes him aside. He tells those leaving that the gate is open in both directions and that everyone leaving will be given some greens for the road. He says that when they want to return, they'll be welcomed back without a word. The people walk through the snow toward their cars and the camp watches them go in silence. Holt, standing next to Aiden, murmurs that Pharaoh understands the merchant in him. He doesn't buy people. He buys doubt in those who remain. A heavy night falls. Vale is burning with fever, delirious, calling out the names of people no one knows. Naomi sits beside him, changing the rags on his forehead. Her only supply of medicine is the alcohol from Holt's flask and nothing else. She looks up at Aiden and, for the first time ever, makes a request. She says that if his house can grow furnaces and towers, then let it grow at least something for her. Midnight answers her. This time, the light of evolution flows not into the walls, but into the ground beneath the hut. The floor in the far corner of the workshop splits open, and a round basin rises from the stone. A spring gushes into the basin from the depths. The water glows with a faint blue light and smells like summer rain. The panel indicates that the living spring property has been added. The spring water is pure. It accelerates wound healing and cleanses away infection. Naomi scoops some up with her palm, tastes it, and looks at the water with the gaze of someone who has spent their entire life working without a miracle and has now received one. She silently fills a flask, walks over to Vale, and washes his wound. By dawn, the fever subsides. The commandant opens his eyes and, without delay, asks whether the group has left and whether the wires have been cut. Naomi says they're cut and that he's wounded and foolish. Vale leans back and says to the ceiling that for the first time this winter, he isn't ashamed to look at it. Outside in the camp, people are standing in line at the spring with every canteen and mess kit they have, and Cyrus is crouching by the spring. The convoy's scribe has come, wrapped in a white cloth, to collect the response to Pharaoh's proposal and has spotted the spring. He's holding glowing water in his palms, and his tin tablet lies nearby in the snow. He looks up and meets Aiden's gaze. He says quietly that he has documented 6 abductions. He says that all 6 fugitives died on the vehicle platforms a day after lifting off the ground. They went out like campfires. He says he wrote about this to Pharaoh and that Pharaoh ordered those pages to be crossed out. Cyrus stares at the water in his palms and says he's tired of crossing things out. He asks if the camp would accept a defector who knows nothing but how to write everything down. A 3-pronged sortie with cutters from the workshop severed the ring of arresters and restored the dome to full power, and in the process, Vale, atoning for his past, took a bullet in the side. Pharaoh, through the scribe Cyrus, lured 36 people with rations, but Aiden let them go in peace, granting them the right to return. At 8 past midnight, the living spring appeared with healing water that saved Vale from infection, while the stricken Cyrus defected to the camp and revealed that all 6 of the shelters seized by the convoy had been destroyed during transport and that Pharaoh was covering it up. Cyrus has been kept under guard in the barracks for a day, and Darren circles around him like a dog around a stranger. But the clerk's records speak for themselves. He pulls a stack of tin sheets with scratched out lines from his bosom. And it's a complete inventory of the convoy. 312 people, 41 firearms, harpoon guns on 8 of the 12 vehicles, fuel sufficient for 19 days at the current rate of consumption, and, most importantly, the convoy code prohibits a siege lasting longer than 20 days because the vehicles must not be immobilized at a single point. Pharaoh is already violating his own code, and people in the convoy are whispering about it. Aiden reads the sheets all night, and in the morning he convenes a council and says there's no need to fight the convoy. They need to make the convoy want to leave on its own. To achieve this, they must strike, not at the people, but at time, fuel, and faith in the commander. A strange reverse siege begins, and it unfolds in a montage. On the first morning, the turret, guided by Cyrus, freezes 3 fuel barrels on the rear vehicle. The ice shatters the containers, and 19 days' worth of fuel into 14. On the second day, the workshop stamps out tin sheets bearing a single line about 6 destroyed shelters, and the wind scatters them across the plain straight toward the vehicles. The convoy's sentries pick them up, read them, and tuck them into their bosoms. On the third evening, at Aiden's request, the dome dims its external glow, and the camp, in full view of the freezing sentries, the camp lights warm windows inside and heats the bathhouse in the new annex, and the smell of bread baked from Holt's flour throughout the entire eastern region reaches the ring of vehicles. On the fourth night, the first defectors appear by the moat, having left with bundles, and with them are 2 convoy guards without cloaks, and they all say the same thing. By Pharaoh's campfires, people are cold and hungry, and they ask the commander why they should die for a stranger's home that will burn out on the platform anyway. Pharaoh responds with a blow. On the 5th morning, the convoy's vehicles turn sideways, and harpoon cannons fire simultaneously from 8 platforms. The harpoons on chains don't reach the hut, nor are they meant to. They dig into the ground along the perimeter beyond the dome's edge. And as the chains tighten, the vehicles begin to back up and pull. The ground beneath the camp groans. Cracks spread across the snow. Cyrus turns pale and says that's how they tore up the roots at the 6th shelter. Pharaoh can't deactivate the dome and has decided to rip the ground itself, foundation and all, out from under the dome. The planks of the embankment burst. The corner of the far barracks tilts. Dishes clatter inside the hut, and the water in the spring surges in waves. The control panel flashes a warning that the integrity of the foundation is at risk. Aiden stands in the middle of the trembling workshop and realizes that the cutters won't help here because there are 20 chains, each as thick as a man's arm. He looks at the panel, which shows 4 hours remaining until midnight, and for the first time speaks aloud to his home. Hang in there, he says, for 4 hours. The camp battles the chains as best it can. The tower freezes the winches, and 2 machines stall. The workshop forges wedges at a frantic pace, and Darren's men drive them into the frozen ground beneath the chains, adjusting the tension angle. Naomi and the women lead the elderly and children to the central barracks, farther away from the tilting walls. Vale, still pale from his wound, stands at the gate with a list of posts because his hands can't lift a crowbar, but the commandant's mind works better than any crowbar. And yet, by nightfall, the ground along the northern edge of the camp swells into a hump, and the first chain, with a screech, tears a chunk of the foundation slab from the depths. The hut tilts by a palm's width. Just a palm's width, but Aiden feels this tilt in his body as if it were his own fracture. Midnight falls on the camp like the toll of a bell. The light of evolution isn't soft this time. It shoots out from the hut in all directions in pillars and sinks into the ground, and the ground responds with a rumble. The panel displays lines that Aiden reads aloud to everyone. The shelter has survived its 9th day under direct threat of destruction. A top-tier property has been added, Giant's Roots. The shelter sends indestructible roots deep into the earth, fusing with the bedrock and becoming inseparable from the ground. Additionally, at the owner's will, the roots can shift the bedrock within the territory's boundaries. Beneath the plain, a sound is born that no one has ever heard before, the sound of a tree growing within the stone. Dark veins as thick as a man shoot out from the foundation downward. and to the sides, and the camp stops, trembling in a single second. The convoy's taut chains clang and snap one after another like threads because now they are not pulling a house. They are pulling the plane itself. 2 vehicles are overturned by the recoil, and then Aiden raises his hand and does what the control panel instructs. He commands the roots to move. The ground in front of the ring of vehicles swells into a slow wave and creeps forward, and the frozen rock rises into a wall 3 times a man's height, cutting off the convoy from the camp. Pharaoh's men throw their harpoons and run toward the vehicles, and in the silence that follows, the entire camp hears the lead vehicle's engine roaring from behind the earthworks and then stalling. In the morning, Pharaoh himself approaches the newly formed stone wall under a white rag. He is alone. Aiden steps out to meet him at the crest of the embankment. The old engineer stares for a long time at the dark veins of roots emerging from the turned over earth, and his face shows neither anger nor excitement. He bears the weariness of a man who has spent 40 years taking things apart and has now, for the first time, encountered something that cannot be taken apart. He says the siege has been lifted. He says the code does not provide for the removal of part of the plane. Then he falls silent and adds in a different voice. He says that the 6 shelters on his platforms have indeed gone out and that he was transporting them to the valley because he believed they would be revived there. He asks, not as an order, but simply as a question, what Aiden is doing that causes his shelter to grow rather than fade. Aiden looks at his fearsome enemy and answers honestly. He says he's not doing anything to the house. He's working with the people. The house is simply responding. Pharaoh stands there for a very long time. Then he says that the convoy needs fuel and food to reach the valley. He offers what he refused on the first day, a trade, and Aiden extends his hand to him over the crest of the rampart in full view of both camps. According to the records of the defector Cyrus, the camp conducted the siege in reverse, striking at the convoy's fuel supplies and eroding their faith in Pharaoh, which is what prompted the defectors. Pharaoh tried to tear the hut from its foundations using harpoons and chains and nearly succeeded, but at the 9th hour of the night, the giants of Corny appeared. They fused the house to the bedrock, severed the chains, and allowed Aiden to move the earth. Pharaoh lifted the siege, acknowledged that the seized shelters were perishing, and for the first time agreed to trade, shaking Aiden's hand. Trade with the convoy is transforming the plane faster than any battle. Pharaoh's machines are camped behind a stone wall, no longer forming a siege ring, but rather the rows of a marketplace. Aiden's workshop repairs their engines in exchange for food and fuel, while greens, healing water, and bread are traded in return. Cyrus dashes back and forth between the 2 camps with his tin sheets and, for the first time in his life, keeps an inventory not of confiscations, but of supplies. A week later, Pharaoh comes to say goodbye. He says he's leading the convoy south toward the valley, but is leaving behind 4 vehicles and 40 men who volunteered to stay. He says one more thing, speaking quietly so only Aiden can hear. In the southern valley sits the council that sent the convoy in search of the legacy. The council is waiting for a top-class hideout. Instead of a hideout, Pharaoh will bring them Cyrus's report on the house that cannot be moved. He says he doesn't know what the council will decide, but he knows these people. These people don't know how to take no for an answer. The convoy heads over the pass, and Aiden watches it depart from the tower. He should feel relieved. He doesn't. Every victory made the player stronger. Darren brought Vale. Vale brought Convoy. As Convoy departs, it leaves behind the shadow of some council in a distant valley.
Meanwhile, the panel is changing the world once again. On the 10th evening, it unfolds before every survivor of the plains and announces the second phase of the Great Glacial Age. The temperature has bottomed out and is frozen at -60, but the panel congratulates the survivors with a new message that sends a chill down Aiden's spine. From now on, the deep ice is awakening.
Creatures of the cold will emerge to the surface and be drawn toward sources of heat. The brighter the heat, the stronger the call. Aiden reads and looks up at his camp, at the golden dome visible 10 kilometers away, at the smoke, the windows, and the greenhouse, at the brightest source of heat on the entire dead plain. Holt, standing nearby, reads the same thing and says, without a trace of a salesy smirk, that they've been building a lighthouse all winter, and only now have they learned for whom it was shining. They've been preparing for 3 days, and this is the final assembly. On the first day, at Aiden's command, the Roots raise a second stone wall around the camp in an outer ring, and the moat between the walls is filled with water, which freezes solid within an hour. On the second day, the workshop converts all the workbenches to weapon production and forges crossbows with steel bows according to the blueprints the panel revealed after the threat emerged. And Darren stations guards on the walls, mixing his own men with the convoys. On the third evening, Naomi sets up a field hospital with 20 cots in the barracks by the spring, while Vale shouts, himself hoarse, directing the guard posts and teaching the people one simple thing. Don't try to be a hero. Retreat behind the walls. The walls and the tower will fight better than any hero. The creatures arrive on the fourth night. At first, the camp hears them. From beneath the plane comes a creaking sound like that of giant styrofoam, and at this sound, the dogs they'd managed to take in over the winter begin to howl. Then the far edge of the snow swells and bursts, and they crawl out of the crevices, as tall as a bull. Their bodies are like roughly chipped ice with veins of blue light running through them. They have no heads. Instead of heads, they have crowns of needles. They don't roar. They creak, and the creaking makes your teeth ache. Their first wave heads straight for the dome like moths to a flame. The tower opens fire, and that's when the horror becomes clear. Freezing rounds are no match for creatures made of ice. The blasts get stuck in their bodies, and the creatures actually pick up speed. Crossbows rattle along the walls, and steel bolts pierce the ice and chip off chunks. But the creatures reach the outer wall and begin to gnaw at it. Literally gnaw. They sink their crowns of needles into the stone, and the stone crumbles. Aiden stands on the tower, frantically scrolling through the control panel, and finds the only thing he can do right now. Roots. He presses his palms against the tower's stone and channels the rock. The outer wall beneath the first creature opens into a pit and snaps shut again, crushing the ice into dust. The blue light inside the crushed creature goes out, so that means they can be extinguished. The night turns into a labor-intensive task. Aiden crushes the creatures with stone like nuts, but there are dozens of them and he's alone. By dawn, he slides down the tower wall with his nose bleeding from the strain. The first wave has been repelled. The outer wall is pockmarked with holes large enough for a fist. Naomi is in the infirmary stitching up 2 wounded men, and everyone realizes that this was a reconnaissance mission. The dome's call has spread throughout the depths, and the next waves will be denser. At the council meeting that evening, something happens that Aiden didn't expect. Vale takes the floor and says that the call can be tricked. The creatures are drawn to heat, so we need to provide false targets for the heat. We'll carry old stove pipes a kilometer away from the walls, burn the convoy's fuel in them, and tear the wave apart using 3 bonfires. Cyrus adds that the convoy's inventory includes 6 kilometers of steel cable, and that between the false bonfires and the walls, we can stretch out cable spikes, so against which the ice will shatter on its own. Aiden looks at the former commandant and the former clerk of the enemy, who are now arguing until they're hoarse about the best way to save his home, and something warm rises in his chest, not from the stove at all. Midnight of the 10th day arrives, while the camp is still arguing. This time, the light of evolution spreads across the ground within the walls like a vast lake. They rise from the earth between the barracks. 8 figures of dark stone, 1.5 times the height of a human, as wide as doors, faceless. On each one's chest smolders a golden vein of light, its root extending into the ground toward the hut. The panel indicates that the stone guard ability has been added. The guards are bound to the roots of the shelter, obey the owner, and protect the territory and its inhabitants. The strength of each guard equals the strength of the rock from which it was raised. The camp stands in complete silence around the 8 stone giants. Darren is the first to react, The former coach approaches the nearest guardian and gently jabs it in the chest with his fist, just as one would test a newcomer in the gym. The guardian slowly turns its featureless head, and Darren jumps back 3 steps. Then he breaks into a grin from ear to ear and says he's dreamed of sparring partners like these his whole life. Only Aiden, standing among his new stone soldiers, isn't looking at them. He's looking south beyond the pass. Because the creatures of the cold are a wave he must now weather. And one day, people will come from the valley who don't know the meaning of the word no. And he must be ready to face them, too. The convoy headed south, leaving behind 40 men and a warning for Pharaoh about the Valley Council, which would send someone seeking refuge. The panel announced the second phase with the awakening of the creatures of the cold drawn to the warmth, and the first wave of icy creatures nearly gnawed through the outer wall until Aiden learned to crush them with his roots. The council adopted Vale's plan for false bonfires and Cyrus's cable hedgehogs, and the 10th midnight brought the stone guard consisting of 8 controllable golems. The second wave of creatures arrives 3 nights later and crashes against the new defenses like against millstones. Vale's decoy bonfires split it into 3 separate streams. Cyrus's wire hedgehogs break the creatures' icy legs as they approach. The stone guard meets the survivors at the outer wall, and from the tower, Aiden watches the battle for the first time, not as a catastrophe, but as work. The guards strike the creatures precisely at the blue veins of light, just as he commanded, and the ice fades and crumbles into dust. By dawn, mounds of shattered ice lie before the walls, and there isn't a single wounded person in the camp. Holt walks along the ridge and muses aloud that the icy crumbs with blue veins resemble salt in some way. A day later, he discovers from the control panel that it is crystallized frost and that it burns 3 times hotter than coal in the furnaces. The creatures that came to destroy the camp become the camp's fuel. Darren laughs and says it's the first time he's seen a war that turns a profit. The week passes almost peacefully, and Aiden has time to notice how his home has changed. It's no longer just a hut. Around the central core, with the old cot where he woke up on the first day, a workshop, a greenhouse, a bathhouse, a spring-fed hall, and galleries leading to the barracks have sprung up. 480 people live under the dome. They work in shifts. They teach the children to read and write, using Cyrus's tin sheets. In the evenings, they sing in the large barracks. Naomi tells him one day by the stove that he has built not a fortress, but a city, and he hadn't even noticed it himself. And, as always in this story, just when things are starting to go well, a problem even bigger than before arises. First, one of those who had left with the convoy returns. He arrives from the south with frostbitten feet and is immediately dragged to the spring. Once he's warmed up, he tells his story. Pharaoh's column has reached the valley. The Valley Council heard the report and arrested Pharaoh for sabotaging the evacuation. At these words, Cyrus drops his papers. It gets worse. The council is organizing what the fugitive calls the Exodus. Not a detachment, not a convoy, a resettlement. 1,500 people, with vehicles, herds, and portable hangars, are heading north. Officially, the council announced that since the shelter cannot be brought to the valley will come to the shelter. The council declared the plain a new land of refuge and the top-class shelter its common property. They will be here in 20 days. The council falls silent for a long time. 1,500 is 3 times the size of the entire camp. And these aren't vermin that can be crushed with a rock, nor are they bandits that can be frozen into the ice. This is a column of children, the elderly and pregnant women. The tower won't fire on such a column, and everyone at the table understands that. Vale speaks first, and his words are frighteningly simple. They cannot be defeated. They can only be fed or buried. The plains offer no third option. Aiden listens to the arguments until midnight. Darren demands that the gates be closed and the walls reinforced because 1,500 mouths will devour the camp in a month. Holt objects, saying that 1,500 hands represent a wealth the plains have never seen if they can find work for them. Naomi remains silent and then asks one thing. How many greenhouses and springs are needed so that no one dies? Not a single person. And Aiden suddenly realizes that this is the very question that has defined his entire winter, he steps away from the table and walks through the galleries to the oldest core of the house, where the rickety cot from that first night still stands. He sits down on it and rests his hand on the wall, which had once been a cracked plank no thicker than a finger. He says aloud to the house what he hadn't dared to say to people. He says he no longer wants to grow like a fortress. He asks the house to learn to grow like a city. Midnight on the 11th day responds in such a way that it can be seen beyond the pass. The light of evolution rises above the camp in a pillar reaching to the low clouds and lasts not for seconds, but for minutes. The earth within the walls ripples in slow waves. The giant's roots hum in the depths like an organ. The panel unfurls the lines one by one. The shelter has reached the limit of solitary evolution. All properties have merged into a single core. A higher order evolution has begun. The shelter is changing class. A new class, a growing city hearth. From now on, the shelter is capable of generating daughter structures with the minor properties of a hearth, a spring, and a greenhouse within the boundaries of its sprawling roots. The rate of growth depends on the number of inhabitants who recognize the hearth as their home, and before the eyes of those pouring out of the camp barracks, they rise from the earth along the galleries. Small houses, 20 on the very first night, with warm walls and a small stove in each, and a garden bed beneath the window pane. Not a fortress for 400. The foundation of a city for thousands. People walk among the newborn houses, touching the warm walls, and some are already arguing over who will live where, and Naomi laughs out loud for the first time all winter. And Aiden stands by the old cannonball, reading the last line on the panel he had rolled up before the others saw it. The line is short. Attention. A higher order evolution is emitting a trace in the system. The trace is visible to all users with administrative access. Aiden reads it 3 times. All winter long, he thought the system was the weather rules without a master. Frost, Midnight, and the Panels. The line says otherwise. The system has users with administrative access. Someone distributed huts to thousands of people, brought frost upon the world, and awakened the creatures. And that someone has just spotted a bright dot on his map, a growing city in the middle of a wasteland that wasn't on the plan. In 20 days, 1,500 people will arrive from the south, people who must be welcomed and fed, and from the depths of the system, a gaze far heavier than any advice from the valley is already fixed on his home. Aiden turns off the panel and steps out to the people beneath the golden dome. He won't spoil their celebration, but he himself won't sleep tonight. The second wave of creatures was defeated without any losses, and their icy shards turned out to be fuel 3 times hotter than coal, and the camp came to life like a small town. The returning fugitive brought news that the Valley Council had arrested Pharaoh and was leading a group of 1,500 settlers to the Exodus Plain, declaring the shelter a public asset with arrival scheduled in 20 days. At 11 o'clock at midnight, the shelter changed its class to Growing Hearth City and began spawning subsidiary houses with small hearths, while a hidden line on the panel warned that the evolution had been noticed by those with administrative access to the system. With 20 days until the Exodus, the camp is spending its time as if every day were a matter of life and death, and that is true. Preparations are in full swing. In the first week, at Aiden's command, the roots push the outer wall out to twice its original width, and within the new ring, daughter houses spring up in rows of 40 per night, while Cyrus sketches the city plan on sheet metal, including a square, warehouses, and an infirmary. In the second week, Holt, with his convoy of vehicles, hauls away from the dead plain every last piece of wood and iron down to the last nail, while the workshop shifts to focus on beds, chimneys, and doors. In the third week, Naomi prepares the reception barracks and trains 24 assistants to sort the sick, while Vale maps out the settlement plan for the future neighborhoods, so much so that even Darren admits that a commandant's mind is more valuable in peacetime than in wartime. By the end of the 20th day, an empty, warm city with a capacity of 2,000 stands within the walls. It waits. And on the evening of the 20th day, the southern horizon begins to smoke. The Exodus appears the next morning, and it is more terrifying than any wave of beasts simply because it is endless. The column crawls down from the pass all day long, trucks with trailers, sleds laden with bales, herds of shaggy bulls that the South had somehow managed to preserve, and people. A river of people, gray from the road. Darren's reconnaissance counts not 1,500, but nearly 1,800, because every survivor they encountered along the way to the Exodus had joined the column. At the head of the convoy are the council's vehicles flying a white banner, and in the lead car rides a man whom Aiden recognizes from the fugitive's description before Cyrus has a chance to whisper his name. Oswald Gray, chairman of the Valley Council, a gaunt, upright old man with the face of someone who has never heard the word no in his life and has no intention of ever doing so. The negotiations take place on the crest of the embankment, and Gray begins without a greeting. He says that the council has declared the plain a sanctuary and that by the right of humanity's survival, this first-class refuge belongs to everyone. He says he has brought the people of the valley home. He speaks eloquently and loudly so that the column can hear, and Aiden realizes that the old man is not making a proposal but issuing an ultimatum wrapped in concern for the people. Aiden responds just as loudly. He says that the city behind him was built for them and that the gates will open today. Every family will have a home with a hearth. Everyone will have a job and a ration. Gray is thrown off balance for a moment because he had been preparing to break their resistance, not to accept a gift. But Aiden isn't finished yet. He states the conditions. The city will be governed just as the camp was by a council of those who work. The Exodus's weapons will be stored in a communal warehouse under joint guard, and the Valley Council will join the General Council as a partner, not as a governing body. Gray smiles subtly and coldly and says that the people themselves will decide whom to trust, and he loses that very evening. Because the people of Exodus enter the gates and find themselves not under authority, but under a roof. People who have been sleeping in the snow for a month rush into warm houses and weep by the stoves. Naomi and her assistants wash, feed, and tend to the wounded until midnight. The spring runs nonstop, and when Gray gathers his people in the square and begins a speech about how they must not sell the valley's freedom for a bowl of soup, they listen to him with half an ear because the smell of bread wafts from Holt's bakery. The old man trails off mid-sentence and watches his people scatter through the warm streets, and for the first time, a crack appears in his straight back. But Gray wouldn't be Gray if he gave up after just one evening. He changes tactics. 3 days later, his people begin going door to door with a census, asking a single question. Who owns the heart of the city? Not the houses, not the streets, but the very heart from which everything grows. Everyone knows the answer. The heart answers to one man, and at the General Council meeting, Gray puts the question squarely on the table. He says that a city where all life hangs on the whim of a single owner is not a refuge but a trap. He demands that ownership be transferred to the council. The hall falls silent because there is truth in the old man's words, and Aiden himself knows it. He steps forward to respond and says what he's been thinking for all 20 days. He says he agrees not to transfer power to the council, which has only been in office for a month. He agrees that having just one person in charge is a weakness. He says he'll ask the house itself if ownership can be divided. And the room gasps because it never occurred to anyone that you could talk to a house. That night, Aiden sits in the old core on a rickety deck chair, scrolling through the panel, and finds a line deep within the properties that he hadn't noticed before. The right to a hearth can be granted. The holder of the right becomes a minor owner within the boundaries of their block. Responsibility is inseparable from the right. He reads it and laughs quietly, then calls up the panel to display the conditions. There is only one condition. The right can be granted only by the one whom the house recognizes as the main hearth, and the house itself will reveal those who are worthy. Midnight arrives, and this time the light of evolution does not build walls. It searches Delicate golden threads stream down from the dome, fan out through the streets, enter the houses, and find people. A thread descends upon Naomi in the infirmary, upon Holt in the bakery, upon Darren on the wall, on Vale, who is poring over the resettlement lists, on Cyrus, who is studying the city map. And before the eyes of the entire city, a single thread travels beyond the square into the resettlers' quarter and descends upon a gray-haired woman from Exodus who, from the very first evening and without any official role, had been cooking soup for her entire freezing caravan. The panel reports that the divided hearth property has been added. 6 small landowners have been recognized. The city will stand even if the main hearth falls. Gray stands in the square and watches as the golden thread bypasses him and his entire council, finding the cook from the caravan instead. And that night, the chairman's straight back breaks for good. In the morning, he comes to Aiden without his entourage and says quietly that he has ruled people for 40 years and thought that power was the right too. He says that Aiden's house has just shown him that power is something you're given for your work, not something you take for holding a position. He doesn't ask for a seat on the council, he asks for a job. Aiden sends him to Cyrus to conduct the city inventory, and the former chairman leaves with tin sheets under his arm, almost happy. Aiden remains in the square looking south because among the Exodus vehicles, the one he was waiting for is missing, the cage carrying the arrested pharaoh. And that evening, Cyrus confirms the worst after prying the information out of Gray's guards. Pharaoh didn't make it to the plains. He was left in the valley in an old mine, along with those who refused to go to Exodus. And in the valley, after the departure of 1,500 people, 300 remained, and there was almost no food left. And for the first time this winter, Aiden finds himself with a debt beyond his city walls. The city council convenes that same evening, and Aiden brings up the issue of the valley. 300 people, and the arrested pharaoh, a 3-week journey south. Darren says the city has just taken in 1,800 mouths to feed, and that dragging another 300 across the dead plains is madness. Holt objects, pointing out that the convoy vehicles are stocked with crystal frost and that the round trip will take a month. The dispute is settled by a gray-haired cook from the supply train named Martha, who speaks plainly at the very first council meeting. She says she was walking from the south past the mine and heard the children of those who refused to go coughing behind the bars. She says that a city that abandons them to winter out there doesn't deserve its dome. The room falls silent, and Aiden puts the matter to a vote. Hands shoot up like a forest. The expedition is prepared in 4 days. On the first day, the workshop converts 4 convoy vehicles into living quarters with small stoves that Aiden maintains right inside the metal cargo beds using a subsidiary function of the hearth. On the second day, Holt loads provisions and healing water into barrels, while Naomi sets up a field infirmary and declares that she's going herself because the frostbite victims will be brought to her, and it's better to start treating them on the road. On the third day, Darren selects 30 fighters and half of the Stone Guard, and Aiden checks for the first time what the panel had suggested. The guards are connected to the roots, but over the winter, the city's roots have spread dozens of kilometers beneath the plain, and the guards can move along the root veins as if on wires. On the 4th evening, Vale remains the city's commander and receives the keys to all the warehouses from Aiden in front of the entire council, so that no one will doubt that everything is in order. The convoy heads south at dawn, and the journey across the dead plain is a chapter in itself. The creatures of the cold sense the heat of the vehicles and emerge from beneath the snow to attack the convoy twice. Both times, the guards meet them at the vehicles and strike at the blue veins, while crossbow bolts finish off the survivors, and the vehicles don't even stop. At the pass, the convoy is caught in a 3-day blizzard, and the vehicles drive blindly along the crevasses. It is here that it becomes clear why Aiden had been running his hand along the side of the vehicle the entire way. A root vein runs beneath the convoy, track by track, and he senses the bedrock beneath the snow, just as a blind man senses the road with his cane, guiding the vehicles between the fissures. On the 11th day of the journey, a valley opens up from the ridge of the pass. Aiden had expected to see the land of plenty described in the Southerners' tales. Instead, he sees gray terraces and dead gardens beneath a shell of ice. And in the middle of the valley, a handful of buildings surrounding a mine mountain, above which rises a single wisp of smoke. The valley is dying just as the plane had died just a month later. The mine greets the column with locked gates and 2 sentries whose faces are gray with hunger. The mine commander steps out onto the wall and shouts that the council has forbidden opening the gates to anyone, and he clings to the order like a drowning man to a plank because he has nothing left but that order. And then Aiden does what he's been doing all winter. He doesn't storm the gates, he sets up a kitchen at the gates. Martha, who had tagged along with the expedition without asking, sets up the pots, and the smell of hot soup wafts over the wall. Naomi sets out the infirmary tables. Aiden builds a small fire pit the size of a doghouse out of the frozen ground right by the gates, and warmth radiates from it across the stones. 2 hours later, the defenders themselves open the gate, and the mine commander weeps unashamedly against the wall. There are 280 survivors in the mine. They find Pharaoh in an iron cage in a distant tunnel. The old engineer has lost half his weight in a month, but his eyes are the same as ever. He looks at Aiden through the bars and, instead of a greeting, says that he calculated the arrival time of the rescue to within 3 days because he believed not in a miracle, but in character. They cut open the cage, and Pharaoh steps out. His first move is not toward the boilers, but toward the machines. He runs his hand along their sides and asks how the undercarriage held up on the pass. The return journey is harder because now the convoy is carrying 300 exhausted people. And on the 5th day of the return trip, the moment this chapter was written arrives. At night, Aiden is awakened not by a scream, but by a light. His personal panel unfolds on its own, without his input, for the first time all winter. Lines unlike any he's seen before scroll across it. The font is unfamiliar, the tone is direct. Administrative Access Level 7 is requesting surveillance of an object exhibiting anomalous evolution. A deviation from the test protocol has been detected. Shelters of a class higher than Fortress are not provided for in the scenario. Explain how the current class was achieved. Aiden sits in the Kung among the sleepers, staring at the unfamiliar lines, and realizes that for the first time, the one who brought this frost has spoken to him. He thinks for a long time and responds with a single phrase, typing it out with his finger on the panel. He writes that the method is called people and that he can only show the details in person. The panel remains silent for a minute, then it responds. Request accepted. An observer will arrive at the site within 7 days. The mode of arrival will comply with the test completion protocol, and it goes dark, leaving no trace. Aiden steps out of the Kung into the night and stands beneath the black sky of the plane. The test completion protocol. So this whole winter has been a test, and it's coming to an end. The end will come on its own in 7 days. He says nothing to the convoy until their return. The city welcomes the expedition as if it were a celebration. Over the course of the evening, the 300 rescued people are settled into ready-made homes, and Pharaoh, in the square before everyone, briefly bows to Aiden and says that the convoy was wrong the whole way because it was carrying the legacy in the wrong direction. The legacy was not meant to be taken to the valley. The legacy was meant to infect every valley, and at the 13th stroke of midnight, the city hears the house's reply. The light of evolution rises above the square, the roots hum, and the panel announces a new property to the entire city, the seed of the hearth. From now on, the main hearth is capable of producing once every 30 days a seed that can be carried away by people and planted in any soil where it grows into a small shelter with a hearth, a spring, and a greenhouse. The seed requires the same thing as the city, people who recognize it as home. Before the eyes of the square, a dark, warm sphere the size of a human head rolls out of the old core and settles in the snow, the first of its kind in the world. Pharaoh looks at it, and the old engineer's hands tremble, and Aiden picks up the seed. It's warm, as if alive. And he finally tells the city about the observer, about the 7 days, and about the completion protocol. He says he doesn't know who will come or why, but he knows that for the first time this winter, they have something to show, something to defend, and something to share with others. The city listens in silence. Then Darren asks from his seat how many days are left. Aiden replies, 4, and the city begins to prepare for the meeting with the Lord of Winter. The expedition to the south saved 280 residents of the starving mine and liberated Pharaoh. Moreover, Aiden discovered that he can lead the stone guard along the root veins and sense the rock beneath the snow. On the way, Aiden was contacted by the bearer of the administrative, declaring his city a deviation from the test protocol and scheduling the arrival of an observer in 7 days under the completion protocol. At the 13th midnight, the hearth seed granted its property, generating once every 30 days a portable seed of a new shelter, and the first seed is already in Aiden's possession. With 4 days to go before the observer's arrival, the city is living the strange life of a person preparing for an exam without knowing the subject matter. The council argues until they're hoarse over what the completion protocol format means. Darren prepares for the worst, tripling the number of guard posts and deploying guards to the walls. Cyrus and Gray sift through all the tin records in search of any mentions of administrators and find just one. In the very first panel mailing on the day the huts were distributed, it was written in small font. It stated that the trial would last until a target result was reached. No one asked over the winter what that result was. Pharaoh approaches the issue like an engineer and says the system must be studied based on its behavior. The system distributed shelters and killed with frost and creatures, but it also rewarded participants for every day they survived. He says this doesn't seem like an execution. It seems like a selection process. The only question is who was selected. Naomi replies quietly across the table that the selection didn't happen at home. At home, everyone had the same shelters, and everyone falls silent because it's true. The midnight evolution occurred at one hut out of thousands, and no one has yet asked why it happened to that one in particular. Aiden is quieter than usual during these council meetings. At night, he sits in the old core and runs through the winter like prayer beads. The first night, with snow slush in the cracks. Naomi at the threshold. A line of old people warming themselves. The forgiven veil with a bucket of water. Pharaoh's hand over the crest of the wall. The gates open to Exodus. Martha's cauldrons by the mine. He searches this chain of events for the moment when his home turned off the main road and cannot find a single moment. His home turned off the road every time along with him. On the third day, a wave of creatures unlike any before arrives. The control panel issues a warning an hour in advance, calling it the final perimeter check. And at those words, a chill runs down Aiden's spine because means the observer is already watching. Emerging from the plain is not a herd, but an army. Hundreds of creatures, and among them a dozen new ones the size of a house, with crowns of needles like ship masts. The city meets them with everything it has built over the winter. Decoy bonfires tear the wave apart. Cable hedgehogs crush the smaller ones. The guards fight at the walls along the root veins, and Aiden from the tower crushes the giants with folds of rock. For the first time, the city fights not with heroes, but with a system where everyone knows their place. Marta, with the cooks, hauls hot drinks up to the walls. Gray, with his inventory, counts the bolt consumption and delivers reserves exactly where they're running out. Pharaoh and the guards are repairing the guards' winches right at the base of the wall. The battle lasts 6 hours, and when the last creature is crushed in a fold of stone, the city discovers that there are no casualties at all. Not a single death. Naomi has 11 wounded, and all of them will survive. People stand on the walls amid smoldering bonfires, looking at one another, and begin to realize, along with Aiden, a simple truth: they are no longer afraid. Winter did everything it could and failed. On the evening of the fourth day, the panel comes to life for every resident at once. The observer arrives at midnight. The manner of arrival is personal. The city never sleeps. The square is packed. And at exactly midnight, the light of evolution does not appear. Instead, right in the middle of the square, without a flash or a sound, a man simply appears. An ordinary man of average height in a gray coat unsuitable for the weather. His face is weary and not young. He stands in the center of the quiet square, looking around the way a man who has returned to the city of his youth would. Then his eyes find Aiden's, and he walks toward him through the parting crowd, stating matter-of-factly that he is Administrator 7, that he has little time and many questions. The conversation takes place where Aiden wanted it to, in the old town center, by a dilapidated deck chair. The administrator sits down on a stool by the first stove, warms his hands in the air, and remains silent for a long time. Then he speaks, and his story turns everything upside down. He says that the great Ice Age is neither a punishment nor a game. It is a shield. The real catastrophe came from outside, and its name doesn't matter because humanity, as it once was, would not have survived it. The administrators managed to do one thing: hide people in trial worlds where the cold burns away not the people themselves, but the weakness of the bonds between them. He says there are hundreds of such worlds. He says that in most worlds, the trial proceeds according to plan. People build fortresses, and the fortresses wage war over resources. By spring, the strongest survives, and it becomes the foundation of a new world. It's cruel, but it works. He looks up at Aiden and says that this world has defied the calculations. Here, instead of 100 warring fortresses, a single one has risen, one that feeds its enemies, rescues others' minds, and distributes seeds. The simulation models call this an error. He came to see the error for himself. Aiden asks about midnight evolution. Why did it end up in his hut, of all places? The administrator smiles for the first time during the conversation and replies that it didn't end up there. The Midnight Evolution talent was embedded in every single hut, all thousands of them. The activation condition was the same everywhere. A shelter evolves if over the past 24 hours, the owner has made it warmer, not just for themselves. Aiden sits there holding his breath. The administrator lists the details, matter-of-factly, as if reading from a checklist. On the first day, the owner caulked the cracks, and this saved only him, so the talent remained silent. But in the evening of that first day, the owner told his neighbor the truth about the firewood instead of gloating, and the system barely counted it as an intention. On the second day, the owner gave the can to the doctor and let her use it to stoke the stove. It only got worse from there. He says that in thousands of other huts, the talent never awoke even once because the heat was kept within the four walls. He says that in 3 worlds out of hundreds, the talent would awaken for a week and then fade when the owners began to exact a toll through fear. He looks at Aiden and says that this house is the only one of them all to have made it to the city. Then the administrator stands up, his face once again weary and businesslike. He says he has come not to bestow a reward, but to carry out the closing protocol. The test's target result has been achieved. This world's trial will close in 7 days. And before the space beyond the core's walls has time to exhale, he finishes the second half of his statement. The closing of the trial means the return of the survivors to the restored outside world. All people. But the protocol does not provide for the relocation of the shelters. The houses will remain here. All of them, including this one. He says this and stares at the floor. Aiden hears the first stove in his house crackling in the silence. The house that grew with him all winter, the one he begged to hold on, and the one that did. In 7 days, they'll take the people away, and he'll be left to die in an empty world. The administrator walks toward the exit and stops at the door without turning around. He says quietly that the protocols are written based on projected worlds, and this world has thrown off those projections. He says that if the owner has any objections to the protocol, they will be accepted for 6 days, and he disappears just as casually as he appeared. The city finds out everything in the morning because Aiden neither knows how nor wants to keep it a secret. He steps out onto the square and recounts the conversation, word for word, about the shield, the hundreds of worlds, the condition of talent, and the return home. The square erupts with joy at the word home, and Aiden lets the people savor that joy without interrupting them. Half the square is still filled with graves, the streets of youth, and memories of summer. People embrace and weep, and Marta wails aloud about the garden she'd been tending for 40 years. Then Aiden finishes by speaking of homes, of how the city will remain here, empty and dead. and the square falls silent so abruptly it's as if the white wave had returned. People turn back toward their streets, toward the greenhouses behind the glass, toward the spring, the guard, and the dome. Over the winter, this had ceased to be a shelter. It had become a home in a way that their former apartments had never been. Darren speaks first, and his voice is unexpectedly quiet. He says that in the outside world, he had a hall to rent, debts, and not a single person who would call him during the winter. He says he doesn't want to go back there. He wants to bring this back there, and he sweeps his arm across the square. The phrase catches on, and it ripples through the crowd and grows. Not to bring ourselves back, to bring the city back. The council meets all day and drafts an objection to the protocol. Strangely enough, it's Gray, whose 40 years of bureaucracy are finally put to good use, who formulates it. The objection goes like this: the trial didn't select people, but a way of life. A way of life cannot be returned to the world separately from what has been built for it. People without a city are simply survivors. People with the city are the result of the trial. A protocol that discards that result follows the letter of the law and kills the meaning. Cyrus neatly rewrites this on a metal plate, and that evening, Aiden posts the text on the panel for Administrator 7. The response arrives a day later, and it is brief. The objection has been accepted for review. The estimated cost of transferring the City Hearth class structure exceeds a single world's quota by 14 times. Review has been suspended due to a lack of resources. Appendix. The resource pool of test worlds is replenished by completed trials. The council reads the response and initially interprets it as a rejection. Pharaoh hears something else. It's the old engineer rereads the appendix 3 times, then looks up and says that this is not a rejection, it's a cost estimate. The system lacks the resources for the transfer because this world is coming to an end on its own. But there are hundreds of worlds, and he asks Aiden the very question that takes the council's breath away. He asks how far the giant's roots actually extend. Aiden closes his eyes and listens to the depths, just as he'd been learning to do all winter. Over the months, the roots have spread beneath the entire plain, beneath the pass, and beneath the valley. But deeper still, beneath them, he had always sensed a bottom, a dense layer that the roots could not penetrate. He speaks of this, and Pharaoh nods as if he'd been expecting it. He says that the bottom is most likely the boundary of the world, and that Aiden has 6 days and the seed of the hearth, and the only question is whether the seed can sprout through the boundaries. Administrator 7 appears in the square that same evening and summoned. He says he heard the request through the system because the roots have begun to press against the bottom and this has been recorded. He stands and looks at Aiden for a long time, strangely, and then says what he came for. He says that protocol forbids moving the city across the border, but protocol says nothing about whether a neighbor can help another neighbor. The test worlds are connected by service veins through which administrators travel between them. If the hearth is capable of producing a seed and the owner is capable of guiding the seed through a service vein, then protocol does not prohibit it because no one ever anticipated such a scenario. He says that in the neighboring world, the trial is unfolding according to the worst-case scenario. There, the strongholds are devouring one another, and if 1 in 10 survives until spring, that's a good outcome. He says that if the hearth seed takes root there and alters the outcome of even a single world, the system will gain a precedent and a resource, and his objection will lose its ground. Then, glancing aside, he adds that administrators are forbidden from interfering with the course of the trials, but it's not forbidden to leave doors open out of forgetfulness, and he leaves. And behind him, in the air of the square, a thin vertical slit of warm light remains suspended. The council doesn't argue for a single minute. They argue only about the team composition. Aiden must go alone because the seed obeys the main source. Everyone begs to go with him, and he takes 3. Darren, because a foreign world means war. Naomi, because a foreign world means the wounded. and Martha, because the seed takes root where everyone is cared for. Vale stays behind to hold the city, and as a farewell, says one sentence to Aiden by the slit. He says that a year ago he would have imposed a tribute on someone like Aiden, but now he would give his right hand for him, and that Aiden should return because the city can survive without the main hearth. But it won't be easy. The 14th midnight arrives an hour before their departure, and the city receives a parting gift from her. The light of evolution falls upon all 6 minor owners, and the panel announces that the distant vein ability has been added. From now on, the minor owners can hear the main hearth at any distance and across any boundaries, and the main hearth can hear them. Naomi is the first to realize what this means, and she smiles. It means that no matter where they go, home will remain in contact with them. The 4 of them enter the slit of light at dawn, and Aiden carries the seed under his arm as if it were alive. The service vein turns out to be a corridor of gray light, and they walk through it for half a day. And then the corridor opens up, and they emerge onto a hilltop beneath a foreign black sky. Below lies the valley of the neighboring world, and it is terrifying. 3 fortresses on 3 hills face each other through their battlements. Between them, on the neutral snow, the black marks of battle and abandoned supply trains loom. And along the valley floor, toward their hill, a procession of people is trudging, people Aiden recognizes instantly because he's seen them all winter long, the exiles, those whom the fortresses had cast out beyond their walls as mouths to feed. 50 people are walking through the frost toward nowhere, led by a teenager pulling a swaddled old woman on a sled. Darren looks down and clenches his fists. Naomi is already unpacking her bag. Martha asks matter-of-factly where to set up the cauldron, and Aiden pulls a warm seed from his bosom, drops to his knees, and shovels away the foreign snow down to the foreign frozen earth. He says to the seed the same thing he once said to his home. He says, "Grow," and he presses it into the soil of the new world. The seed sprouts by nightfall, and this foreign world sees for the first time what Aiden's plane had seen. From the frozen hill rises a house with a hearth inside, a spring-fed basin, and a garden bed under glass, and 50 exiles stand around it in disbelief. Martha is already cooking. Naomi is already bandaging wounds. Darren is already posting the first sentries from yesterday's survivors. And Aiden is doing what he's been doing all winter. He opens the door to everyone and tells them that warmth here is exchanged for work, and that there's work for everyone. From there, time moves in fast forward because Aiden has lived through this once before and is now simply repeating it more quickly. In the first week, the small hearth endures 7 midnight hours and grows with walls and stoves because every evening it gets warmer, and not just for the owners. In the second week, the outcasts from across the valley flock to the house, and the hearth gives birth to its first outbuildings, while the fortress scouts peer at the growing settlement through their spyglasses, unable to comprehend what they're seeing. In the third week, the hungriest of the 3 fortresses comes to seize the miracle by force, but runs into a stone wall raised by roots and the guards, and leaves empty-handed. 3 days later, its own soldiers begin defecting to the hearth because they're fed there but not at home. By the end of the month, the commander of the first fortress comes to the gates unarmed and asks that his men be accepted because he has nothing left to feed them with. Aiden accepts them all and sets a condition he already knows by heart: weapons to be turned over to the communal arsenal, and a council to be formed from among those who work. The second fortress surrenders a week after the first. The third holds out the longest out of pride and surrenders not to Aiden, but to its own women, who one morning simply open the gates from the inside and leave with their children in search of warmth. And on the night when the last inhabitant of the valley acknowledges the hearth as home, the sky of the foreign world flashes with a familiar golden glow. The report before Aiden with the text he had been waiting for. The target result of the world's trial has been achieved ahead of schedule. Method of achievement: external seed. Precedent recorded, resource from the completed test credited, and then comes the second line, which makes Aiden's hands tremble. The objection to the transfer of the city hearth structure has been reinstated. Missing resource: 13 worlds. The system grants the owner of the main hearth access to the service veins. Then begins what will later be called the Year of Seeds, and Aiden spends it on his feet, traveling between worlds. He cannot be everywhere. Nor should he. A seed departs for each subsequent world, and with it go the people of his city, who have become masters of heat. Vale carries the seed to a world where commandants rule over everyone and speaks to them in their language until the hearth retrains them in another. Pharaoh, along with the convoy, transports the seed across the world of the eternal blizzard on tracked vehicles and grows the hearth right on the platform, proving that a home can come to the people on its own. Cyrus and Gray establish a hearth in a world where fortresses wage war with regulations and rules and defeat them with their own weapon of honest accounting. Holt opens exchange courtyards across the worlds, and warmth begins to be traded more honestly than gold. Darren establishes hearths in the most war-torn worlds, and his stone sparring partners wean the fortresses from the habit of solving hunger through assault. Naomi goes where the frosts have already reaped the most terrible harvest, and the springs of her hearths pull worlds up from the very depths. And in every world, the same thing repeats itself. A hearth grows not from the strength of those who brought it, but from that very first night when a local host lets a stranger sit by the fire. The distant vein sings in Aiden's head with the voices of all his people from all the worlds, and as he falls asleep, he hears them just as a house hears its own rooms. The 13th world closes at the end of the year, and that very night, Administrator 7 comes to the old core of the first city and sits down on the same stool by the same first hearth. He rests his hands on his knees and says that the resource has been gathered, the objection has been resolved, and the protocol has been rewritten. He says that from now on it is called the Hearth Protocol, and that the remaining worlds will be brought to a close, according to it. Then he falls silent and speaks his final words. The return is scheduled for midnight. Everyone and everything. The final midnight of this story descends upon the plain where, a year ago, an office worker awoke in a dilapidated hut. The entire city stands in the square, neighbors holding hands, and Aiden stands by the old core, his palm pressed against the wall, just as on that first night. The light of evolution rises over the world for the last time, not golden, but white like early morning. The panel displays the final lines. The test is complete. The transfer of the city hearth structure is confirmed. The return has begun, and the world fades gently, as if a lamp were being extinguished. Aiden opens his eyes to the sun, the real yellow sun warming his cheek. He stands on a green hill, and below lies the outside world as it has been restored. Empty, clean plains waiting for people, and all around him on the hill stands his city. All of it, down to the very last outbuilding and the old core with a rickety deck chair inside. The roots have sunk into the new warm earth, and the dome has melted away, no longer needed. The greenhouse smells of earth and summer. People stand on the slopes of the hill, gazing at the sun, crying and laughing. And all across the horizon, in every direction, other cities rise on other hills. 13, 15, more. All the settlements of all the worlds have returned, each with its own people, and the far one song echoes in Aiden's head with all the voices at once. Vale waves to him from the neighboring hill. Somewhere out there, Pharaoh is surely already inspecting the undercarriages of his vehicles on the new land. Naomi stands nearby, squinting into the sun, and says that for the first time in a year she has no one to treat. Darren lies down right in the grass and declares that he's earned it. Martha is already thinking aloud about where to plant a garden here. Administrator 7 stands slightly to the side in his gray coat, which is finally appropriate for the weather, and Aiden approaches him with one last question. He asks what will happen to Aiden himself now. After all, the trial is over, and there's nothing left for the talent to test. The administrator looks at the town on the hill and the wisps of smoke from the hearths stretching to the horizon, and replies that the talent was never in the hut. The hut merely measured. The talent to make what is warm even warmer, not just for oneself, remains with the person, and nothing can take it away now. He wishes him a good summer and walks down the slope, and at some point he's simply gone. And Aiden returns to his home. He walks through the town that began with planks of fingers width thick and clumps of slush in the cracks. He enters the old core and sits down on a rickety deck chair that the house has preserved through all its transformations and relocations, just as a person keeps their first photograph. He places his palm on the wall. The wall is warm. not from the stove, just warm, like the side of a living being. In the evening, the town lights up its windows under the first sunset of its new life, and from hill to hill through the twilight, the lights of other towns echo one another. Aiden stands on the threshold of his home watching this, and thinks that a year ago he was freezing in the wasteland with nothing but a single hut, and that hut turned out to be a seed, and winter turned out not to be the end of the world, but its planting. He steps inside and closes the door behind him, and for the first time in its entire history, the house isn't waiting for midnight. It no longer needs to get better by morning. It's already home. The city finds out everything in the morning because Aiden can't and won't hide it. He steps out onto the square, where half the town is already gathered, and recounts the night's conversation word for word about the external catastrophe and the shield made of hundreds of frozen worlds, about how the talent known as Midnight Evolution lay dormant in every hut on the plain and remained silent in all but one, about the condition that no one knew about. A house grows if, over the course of a day, it has become warmer, not just for its owner. People listen and glance at their neighbors, and Aiden sees the same thought cross their faces. Everyone recalls their first week, who shared and who shut themselves away. Then he speaks of returning home, and the square erupts with joy for half the town. Their parents' graves remain there, along with the streets of their youth and memories of grass and summer rain. People hug and shout, and Martha cries out at the top of her lungs about the garden she planted 40 years ago and which may have survived. Aiden lets them enjoy this joy to the fullest and doesn't interrupt. Then he addresses the other half, about how the protocol doesn't allow for hiding, about how the city will remain here empty and dark amid the eternal snows. All the houses and greenhouses in the spring, and the old center with the first lounge chair. The square falls silent so abruptly as if the white wave had descended upon it once more. People slowly turn around and look at their streets, at the windows behind which they nursed sick children, at the wall where they stood against the creatures, at the bakery from which the scent of morning bread wafts. Over the winter, this had ceased to be a shelter. It had become a home in a sense that their former apartments, with their radiators and elevators, had never been homes. Darren speaks first, and his voice is unexpectedly quiet for a man who has always spoken with authority. He says that in the outside world, he had a hall to rent alone and a phone that never rang once all winter. He says that no one is waiting for him there, but here his shift on the wall begins at 6. He says he doesn't want to go back there. He wants to bring this back there, and he sweeps his hand over the square, the streets, and the dome. Others pick up on his words. The old woman from Exodus says that for the first time in her life, she's living in a house that was built for her, not sold to her. The young guard says he grew up in a car and that this city is the first place he feels sorry for. The voices surge and merge, and by noon, the city knows its will, not to reclaim themselves, to reclaim the city. The council meets until dark and drafts an objection to the protocol. Strangely enough, it is Gray, whose 40 years of bureaucracy are finally put to good use, who formulates it, and the old man works on the text with the delight of a master returning to his craft. The objection turns out to be simple and firm. The trial did not select people, but a way of life. A way of life does not exist separately from what it has built. People without a city are merely surviving bodies. People with a city are the result of the trial. The protocol that returns the bodies and discards the result follows the letter of the law and kills the meaning of the entire winter. Cyrus rewrites the text on the metal plate 3 times until Gray is satisfied with every comma that is missing from the text. In the evening, Aiden posts the objection on the bulletin board, and the city goes to sleep without unclenching its fists. The reply arrives a day later, and it is as cold as the first night of winter. The objection has been accepted for review. The estimated cost of transferring the City Hearth class structure exceeds a single world's quota by 14 times. Review has been suspended due to a lack of resources, and below is a brief appendix. The resource pool of test worlds is replenished by completed trials. The council reads and hears the rejection. Naomi lowers her head. Darren pounds his fist on the table. Only Pharaoh sits motionless over the sheet of tin. rereading the appendix for the 4th time. Then he raises his head and says that everyone has misunderstood. This isn't a rejection. It's a cost estimate. You don't tell an engineer no. You tell an engineer we're short 14 parts, and that means we need to find 14 parts. The system is replenished with completed trials. Their world is coming to an end, just one, and it's not enough. But there are hundreds of worlds, and according to the administrator, most of them die in the strife of fortresses and will never come to an end at all. Pharaoh scans the council and asks Aiden a question that makes everyone at the table hold their breath. He asks how far the giant's roots actually extend. Aiden closes his eyes and listens to the depths, just as he had learned to listen all winter long, through the rock and the frost. Over the months, the roots have spread beneath the entire plain, beneath the pass, beneath the dead valley, and further into the darkness. But beneath them, at the very bottom, he has always sensed the same thing. A dense, smooth layer through which not a single root could penetrate. He speaks this aloud, and Pharaoh nods as if he had been waiting for exactly that. He says that the bottom is most likely the boundary of the world, that worlds lie side by side like rooms in a single house, and that Aiden has 6 days and the seed of the hearth. And the whole question is whether the seed can sprout through the walls between the rooms. Administrator 7 appears in the square that same evening on his own accord without being summoned. He says that the roots have begun to press against the bottom, and the system has detected it, so he came before the city could do anything foolish. He stands there for a long time, looking at Aiden with the gaze of a man arguing with himself. Then he states the reason for his visit, choosing his words carefully. The protocol explicitly forbids moving a city across the border, but the protocol says nothing about whether a neighbor can help another neighbor. The worlds are connected by service veins, through which administrators travel between trials. If a hearth is capable of producing a seed, and the owner is capable of carrying the seed through the vein and planting it in foreign soil, then the protocol does not forbid this for one reason. No one ever anticipated this. He says that in the neighboring world, the trial is unfolding according to the worst-case scenario. 3 fortresses are devouring the valley and each other, and by their calculations, only 1 in 10 people will survive there until spring. He says that if the seed changes the outcome of even one doomed world, the system will gain a precedent and a resource, and the city's objection will have room to breathe. Then he turns away and adds, gazing at the snow, that administrators are forbidden to interfere with the course of the trials. But no clause prohibits leaving without closing the door behind you. He walks across the square and disappears. And where he stood, a thin, vertical slit of warm, gray light remains suspended in the air. The council doesn't debate for even a minute whether to go or not. They argue only about the composition of the team, and they argue fiercely. Aiden must go alone, because the seed obeys only the main hearth, and that's not up for discussion. Everyone, without exception, wants to go, including Gray, who points to his inventory list and argues that the new settlement needs an accountant. Aiden takes 3 people. Darren, because a foreign world means war, and they need someone to stand between the war and the cauldron. Naomi, because a foreign world means hunger and frostbite, and they need hands to patch people up. And Martha, who didn't ask to come, but simply gathered the cauldron and ladles in silence and stood by the opening first, because, in her words, a seed takes root where food is cooked for everyone, and that's not up for debate, especially not now. Vale takes charge of the town and does so in full view of everyone, following the inventory with warehouses, posts, and shifts, so that no one is left with any questions about order during the absence of the main hearth. Then he takes Aiden aside and says one sentence to him face to face. He says that a year ago he would have imposed a tribute on someone like Aiden without batting an eye. But now he'd give his right hand for him and ask him to return because the city can manage without the main hub. but it's not good. Aiden replies that things are never bad for the rear commander, and both realize that this is the warmest farewell two men are capable of this winter. The 14th midnight arrives an hour before departure, and the city receives a parting gift. The light of evolution builds nothing this time. It settles in golden threads upon the 6 small owners wherever they may stand, and seeps under their skin while the panel unfolds the lines. The distant vein trait is added. From now on, the little owners can hear the main hearth at any distance and across any boundaries, and the main hearth can hear them. The connection cannot be jammed by anything except death. Naomi is the first to understand what this means, and for the first time in a day she smiles. Wherever they go, home will go with them inside. The 4 of them enter the crevice at dawn, and Aiden carries the seed tucked under his arm near his heart. It's warm and heavy, like a sleeping little animal. The service tunnel turns out to be a long corridor of even gray light, without walls and without echoes, and they walk through it for half a day, with Martha grumbling the whole way that in places like this, one is supposed to at least have a snack. And then the corridor ends, and they emerge onto the crest of a hill beneath a foreign sky. The sky is black with a hint of green, and the frost here is harsher and drier than in their homeland. Below lies the valley of a neighboring world, and even Martha falls silent at the sight of it. 3 fortresses sit on 3 hills, gazing at one another through embrasures and searchlights.
Between them, on the neutral snow, craters and abandoned supply trains loom dark, along with something Naomi recognizes at a glance, but doesn't speak of aloud.
And at the bottom of the valley, a line of people is trudging straight toward their hill, and Aiden recognizes that gait instantly because he's seen it all winter long. The exiles. The extra mouths that the fortresses had cast out beyond the gates to conserve supplies. 50 people are walking through the frost toward nowhere, led by a 14-year-old boy who is pulling an old woman wrapped in rags on a makeshift sled, falling, getting up, and dragging her on. Darren looks down and clenches his fists. Naomi is already unzipping her bag as they walk. Martha surveys the ridge with a businesslike air and asks where the wind is calmer because the cauldron prefers a sheltered spot. And Aiden pulls a seed from his bosom, drops to his knees, and with his bare hands shovels away the foreign snow down to the foreign frozen earth, and the earth burns his palms with cold. He presses the seed into the hole, leans close to it, and says to it the very same word he said a year ago in the darkness of his dying wife's wife. He says, "Grow." And beneath his palms, the foreign dead earth grows warm for the first time this winter. The city demanded that not only people, but also itself be returned to the outside world. However, consideration of the objection has been suspended due to a shortage of system resources equivalent to 14 completed trials. Pharaoh read the rejection as a budget estimate, while Administrator 7 deliberately left open a service vein to the neighboring dying world of the 3 fortresses where Aiden, Darren, Naomi, and Marta must plant the seed of the hearth to set a precedent. At the 14th midnight, a distant vein was established connecting the 6 small landowners to the main hearth across all boundaries, and in the alien world, the group encountered those exiled from the fortresses, and Aiden planted the seed in the frozen soil of the new world. The seed sprouts by nightfall, and the alien world sees for the first time what Aiden's plane saw a year ago. Aiden's plane. A house rises from the frozen ridge. First, a log cabin with a hearth inside, from which a steady heat rises of its own accord. Then a spring-fed bowl of water that glows and smells of summer rain. Then a garden bed beneath murky glass, where greenery sprouts before their eyes. 50 exiles stand around the growing house, hesitating to approach, and a teenager with a sled stares at the door as if there were a trap behind it, because all his experience tells him that 2 warm doors without a catch. Aiden opens the door from the inside and says that warmth here is traded for work, and that there's work even for someone who can only shovel snow while sitting down. Naomi takes the old woman with the sled first. Martha puts the pot on, and the smell of the stew speaks louder in an hour than any words ever could. By morning, all 50 are sleeping in the warmth for the first time in months. and a teenager named Joran is the last to fall asleep after sitting by the door from the inside all night, keeping watch. From there, time moves and fast forward because Aiden has already lived through this once and is now simply repeating it with more confidence and speed. During the first week, the small settlement endures 7 consecutive nights and grows with walls, stoves, and a bathhouse because every evening it grows warmer, not just for the owners, and talent works like clockwork. In the second week, those driven out from across the valley flock to the house one by one and in families, and the settlement gives birth to its first outbuildings. And from the 3 hills, the growing settlement peering through spyglasses and failing to understand what they see, for in their worldview, nothing but craters can grow in the middle of the neutral zone. In the third week, the hungriest of the fortresses comes to seize the miracle with a force of 200 bayonets and runs aground against the stone wall raised by roots and the stone guard that Aiden had led along the vein in its wake and departs empty-handed, having lost not men but face. And 3 days later, its own soldiers begin defecting to the settlement at night because there they're fed for their work, whereas at home they get a quarter of a ration for standing guard. By the end of the month, the commandant of this fortress comes to the gates himself, unarmed, and standing before Aiden is the man who, a month ago, had been casting out the surplus mouths into the freezing cold. He says he has nothing left to feed his men and that he is ready to accept any terms. Aiden states the terms he knows by heart: weapons to be turned over to a common arsenal, a council made up of those who work, and first and foremost to send home everyone who had been expelled. The commandant swallows hard and agrees, and Yoren, standing behind Aiden's shoulder, looks at the man who had driven him and his grandmother out to die, and finds not the expected hatred, but something resembling pity, which surprises even him. The second fortress surrenders a week after the first, this time without an assault, coming straight to the negotiating table. The third holds out the longest out of sheer pride and does not surrender to Aiden. One morning, its gates open from the inside, and women and children emerge, walking across the valley toward warmth, leaving the commander of the third fortress to command empty walls. He arrives last and silently lays down his weapon. And on the night when the last inhabitant of the valley recognizes the hearth as home, the foreign black sky flashes with gold for the first time. A panel unfolds before Aiden, displaying the text he had been waiting for with bated breath. The target result of the peace test has been achieved ahead of schedule. Method of achievement: external seed. Precedent: established, resource credited. And the second line, which makes his hands tremble. Review of the objection has resumed. Missing resource: 13 worlds. The owner of the main hearth has been granted access to the service veins. Aiden stands beneath a foreign golden sky and hears through the far vein how his city, to which Vale has just read the same lines from the square, is rejoicing as if beyond the world's borders. What follows is what will later be called the Year of Seeds. Aiden cannot be in all 14 worlds at once, and the most important discovery of the year is that he doesn't need to be. The hearth has taught the people, and now the people carry the hearth. A seed departs for each successive world, and with it go the masters of warmth from the first city, and each world takes on a character of its own. Vale surrenders to the commandant's office and leads the seed into a world where everything is held together by military authority. He speaks to the local commandants in their language of orders until the hearth retrains them in another language. Pharaoh, along with, carries the seed through a world of eternal blizzards where no structure remains in place, and cultivates the hearth directly on a tracked platform, proving that a home can come to the people on its own, and this nomadic city is later named after him. Cyrus and Gray take a world where fortresses wage war, not with assaults, but with inventories and rules. And they defeat them with their own weapons, meticulous record-keeping, after which Gray admits that for the first time in 40 years, bureaucracy has saved people rather than stifled them. Holt opens trading posts in 3 worlds in a row, and warmth begins to be traded more honestly than gold. And the old man says he has reached the pinnacle of his craft because he trades in a commodity that only increases with distribution. Darren sets up hearths in the most war-torn worlds, and his stone sparring partners patiently wean the garrisons of the habit of solving hunger through assault. Naomi goes where the frosts have reaped the most devastating harvest, and the springs of her hearths pull worlds up from the very bottom. In one of them, she is still called not by her name, but by a word that means she who came with water. Martha simply cooks in 6 worlds in a row, and 6 worlds surrender to her cauldron faster than any guard. Yoren tags along with Aiden as a liaison, and 6 months later, he himself carries the seed to his 14th world and plants it with the same hands that were once frostbitten, the very hands that once pulled the sled. And in every world, the same thing repeats itself with the precision of a law of nature. The hearth does not grow from the strength of those who brought it. It grows from the very first night when a local lets a stranger into his hearth. The distant vein sings in Aiden's head with ever-changing voices, and as he falls asleep in yet another world, he hears them all just as a house hears its own rooms. The 13th resource world closes at the end of the year, and that very night, Administrator 7 arrives at the old core of the first city and sits down on the same stool by the very first hearth. He warms his hands in the air for a long time, even though he isn't cold. Then he says that the resources have been gathered, the objection has been fully resolved, and the closure protocol has been rewritten permanently. From now on, it is called the Hearth Protocol, and all remaining worlds will be closed according to it, not by selecting the strongest fortress, but by the growth of a shared home. He says that the computational models resisted to the very end and that they had to be persuaded by 14 established facts. Then he stands up and says his final words. The return is scheduled for midnight. Everyone and everything. The final midnight of this story descends upon the plain where, a little over a year ago, an office worker woke up in a dilapidated hut amid the howling wind. The city stands in the square, every last person present, and people are holding hands, neighbor to neighbor, and visitors from other worlds stand intermingled with the old-timers because everyone who could make it has gathered for the return. Aiden stands by the old core, his palm pressed against the wall, just as on that very first night, and Naomi stands to his right, Darren to his left, and Martha grumbles from behind that such events are always scheduled for the coldest times. The light of the latest evolution rises over the world, not golden, but white like that very first morning, and it doesn't blind but embraces. The panel displays the final lines. The trial is complete. The transfer of the city hearth structure has been confirmed. The return has begun. Thank you. The panel writes the final word for the first time all winter, and the world fades gently like a lamp being turned off in a room where everyone is already asleep. Aiden opens his eyes, feeling the warmth on his cheek. The real yellow sun hangs over a green hill, and the air smells of grass and nearby water. Below lies the restored outside world, clean, empty, and waiting. And all around Aiden on the hill stands his city. All of it. The streets and greenhouses and the bakery and the wall with traces of the creatures' crowns, traces that no one bothered to cover up as a mementos, and the old core with a rickety lounger inside. The roots have sunk into the new warm earth with a hum of recognition, and the dome has melted away, no longer needed, dissolving into the blue sky. And all across the horizon, in every direction, other cities rise on the distant hills. 13 resource cities, the nomadic city of Pharaoh, on its tracks, the city of Yoran, and farther still, all the way to the haze. All the centers of all the worlds have returned, each with its own people, and the song of the far realm sings in Aiden's head with all its voices at once, and for the first time, not a single voice is asking for help. Vale waves from the neighboring hill. Naomi squints into the sun and says that for the first time in a year, she has no one to heal and doesn't know what to do with herself. Darren lies down in the grass in a cross and declares that he's earned it. Martha is already walking up the slope, thinking aloud about where to plant the garden and how many ordinary apple seeds she'll need since the miraculous seeds have run their course. Administrator 7 stands off to the side in a gray coat that's finally appropriate for the weather.
Aiden approaches him with the final question of the whole story. He asks what will happen to him now.
The trial is over, there will be no more midnight, and there is nothing left for talent to measure. The administrator gazes at the wisps of smoke rising from the hearths all the way to the horizon and replies that talent never lived in the hut. The hut was a device. It merely measured what a person did and displayed the result on its walls. The talent to make what is warm even warmer, not just for oneself, remains within a person, and no system can now turn it off, because it has spread across the world through thousands of people and has simply become a way of life. He wishes everyone a good summer, and he walks down the slope, and at some point he is simply gone, and the grass where he walked is not trampled. In the evening, the city lights up its windows under the first sunset of a new life, and from hill to hill through the warm twilight, the lights of other cities call out to one another, just as the campfires once did on the dead plain, only now there is no fear in this call and response. Aiden walks through his city, slowly and alone, past the bakery where Holt is already arguing with someone over the price of flour, past the infirmary, which is empty, past the wall, where Darren still lies in the grass. He enters the old core and sits down on a rickety deck chair that the house has carried through all its evolutions and all its borders, just as a person carries their first photograph through life. He rests his palm on the wall. The wall is warm, not from the stove, just warm like the side of a living creature sleeping nearby. A year ago, he was freezing on this cot in a rickety hut and thought he wouldn't live to see morning. The hut turned out to be a seed. Winter turned out not to be the end of the world, but its planting. And warmth turned out to be the only thing in the world that grows when you give it away. He turns off the lamp and lies down. And for the first time in its entire history, the house does not wait for midnight. It no longer needs to become better by morning. It is already home. The seed of the hearth peacefully absorbed all three strongholds of the neighboring world, setting a precedent, after which Aiden's comrades completed 13 worlds within a year of the seed, and the completion protocol was rewritten into the Hearth Protocol. On the final midnight, all people and all Hearth cities were transported to the restored outer world, where dozens of settlements sprang up on the hills, and the administrator revealed that talent had always been an inherent human trait and was now irreversible. Aiden returned to the old core of his home, and the story is complete. All plotlines are resolved. The end